Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the frozen jaws of a Nordic winter, where the wind slices through your clothes like a jealous ex and the snow stacks higher than your regrets. You're a Viking now, not the horned helmet fantasy version, but the real kind, waking up in the pitch black chill of a blizzard that's decided to overstay its welcome. There's no central heating, no modern insulation, no Gore-Tex anything, just you, some crude tools, and the creeping realization that you probably won't survive this. Unless, of course, you do what the Vikings did, build smarter, live closer, and hope the roof doesn't cave in. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, what city are you watching from? What's the time right now? Drop it in the comments, let's see who's the latest night owl out there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late November in early medieval Scandinavia. The sun rises like it's doing you a favour and dips out before you've even finished the first half of your chores. The cold isn't just cold, it's a personality. It seeps through bone and wood, turning even the most rugged warriors into grumpy piles of wool and frostbite. But here's the twist. Your ancestors had no synthetics, no electric blankets, and no backup plan. So what did they do? They outthought the weather. The first thing you notice, squinting through the morning frost, is that the world is white. Everything is smoothed out by snow except for the dark humps of what look like hills, but are actually homes. Viking shelters weren't towering log cabins with puffing chimneys. Nope. They were low-slung, earth-hugging, and surprisingly humble. If you didn't know better, you'd think you were looking at a farm field with a few weird lumps, because the name of the Viking winter game wasn't visibility or grandeur, it was survival. The blizzards weren't a joke. Some storms could last days, burying trails and isolating farms. Temperatures plunged below freezing and stayed there for weeks. Frostbite was a morning routine. Vikings didn't just build houses, they built bunkers. You had to. And your first lesson in this world is, don't let the cold in and don't let the heat out. And so, your Viking ancestors built their homes not just to stand, but to embrace the cold while keeping it outside. The harsh weather became part of the design, not something to fight directly. Roofs were steep but covered in thick layers of turf and sod. The walls were packed with whatever offered the best mix of structure and insulation, sometimes even layers of earth themselves. The houses weren't pretty, but they were warmish, survivable. You shuffle through the snow toward one of these turf homes, built low into a hillside. The entrance is tiny, not because Vikings were small, but because warmth is a miser, and it escapes through doors, so the smaller the opening, the fewer chances it has to bolt. The doorway leads into a narrow passage that turns once or twice, again, to stop the wind from blowing straight in like it owns the place. Inside, your nose wrinkles. There's the smell of smoke, wool, damp wood, and bodies. Lots of bodies. You're sharing this space not just with your family, but with livestock too. But we'll get to that soon enough. For now, what you notice most is the sudden, blessed difference in temperature. It's not exactly cosy, but compared to the ice wind outside, paradise. And here's where the genius comes in. Viking shelter building wasn't random. These homes were designed with precision, even if they didn't look like it. They were typically long and narrow, called longhouses for a reason, and stretched out along the land like sleeping beasts. That shape wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. Heat had less space to escape sideways, and a central hearth could warm a linear space more efficiently. You're starting to realise that nearly everything about this place was built to squeeze out every last bit of heat and hold on to it like treasure. Now, fun fact. Some scholars argue that Vikings actually adopted a lot of their shelter-building strategies from earlier Celtic or Germanic tribes. Others think the harsh climate shaped the design independently across the whole north. It's one of those debates that archaeologists love. Who borrowed from whom? Who built it first? But let's be honest, when the wind howls like a banshee and the snow's climbing past the doorframe, you don't care about the academic citations. You just care that it works. As you move deeper into the longhouse, your fingers begin to thaw. You hear the dull roar of the blizzard muffled outside by the thick walls. These turf layers, essentially big chunks of grassy soil stacked on the roof and walls, aren't just for show. They insulate shockingly well. It's a living roof, and in the spring it might even bloom with wildflowers, but in the winter it's the barrier between survival and becoming an ice sculpture. Now here's a quirky fact you wouldn't expect. Some Viking homes had no chimneys, just a smoke hole in the roof, or nothing at all. The smoke from the central hearth would fill the room, rising up and slowly filtering out. You're coughing just thinking about it, right? But that smoke served a purpose. It helped keep bugs out of the thatch, dried clothes, and preserved food hanging in the rafters. Bonus? It also made sure the beams didn't rot. Trade-off. Your lungs paid the price. You grab a wooden cup of something warm, probably weak beer because water isn't exactly safe in this era, and glance around. You realise this isn't just shelter. This is a survival engine. Every feature, from the low ceilings to the layered walls, from the shared sleeping spaces to the animal stalls tucked into the corners, works toward one goal. Make it through the storm. Live to see spring. And right now you're just hoping the roof holds and that the wind doesn't shift. But for all its roughness, for all its smells and smoke and creaks, this shelter works. It works better than you'd expect. And that, honestly, is the only reason you're not a Viking popsicle right now. You wake up to the dull ache of cold still biting at your toes, even though you've been cocooned in layers of wool and fur all night. The hearth has burned down to coals, and someone, probably the unlucky one who lost the dice toss, is already moving to rekindle the fire. Outside you can hear the blizzard still raging, snow hissing against the sod walls, and even though you're technically indoors, you still feel the presence of the storm like a wild animal pouring at the door. It makes you wonder, why here? Why did they choose this spot to build their home, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wind, snowdrifts and misery? Well, that's the next big thing Vikings had to get right. Location, location, survival. Picking the right spot for a shelter wasn't just about where the land looked pretty. It was about where the land wouldn't kill you. And when you're building a home meant to stand against months of howling, sub-zero storms, you can't just throw a few logs together and hope for the best. You need strategy. You need microclimates. You need a deep, possibly generational understanding of your landscape. And you need to think like a Viking. So now imagine it's you, wandering through a frostbitten valley in southern Norway, holding a simple iron axe in your hopes of not dying. You need to find a building site. What are you looking for? First up, shelter from the wind. Always. The Vikings learned quickly that the biggest threat in a blizzard wasn't just cold, it was wind chill. A dry cold could be tolerable, even manageable, but the wind could drop perceived temperatures by tens of degrees and strip warmth from your body faster than firewood in December. So natural windbreaks were your best friend. Low valleys, hillsides, dense tree lines. Any of these might offer a buffer from the relentless Arctic gusts. It wasn't just a comfort issue. A poorly placed home exposed to direct wind would lose heat at an insane rate. Every hour, warmth would be siphoned off through cracks, under doors, or straight through the roof. So Vikings often built into hillsides or pressed their longhouses against the land, letting the earth itself serve as both wall and shield. It's not about looking good, it's about not dying. Then there's water access. Counterintuitive as it may sound in the age of snow, you still need drinkable water, even when everything's frozen. That meant choosing land near a stream, spring, or meltwater pool. But, and here's the tricky bit, it couldn't be too close, or the ground would be unstable. The risk of dampness and rot would skyrocket, and if the water froze solid midwinter, you were stuck hacking through a foot of ice just to get a drink. Ever try that with an iron blade in -20 degrees while your fingers feel like wood? Yeah, exactly. And then there's elevation. Too low and you risk flooding during sudden melts or rainstorms. Yes, even snow country gets those. Too high, and you're battered by wind with no protection. The sweet spot? A slightly raised south-facing slope, ideally with a dense tree line to the north and west. If you're lucky, you've got a natural stone outcrop nearby to use in construction, or to anchor your shelter against storms. South-facing was the magic direction, more sun exposure, slightly warmer ground, and better snowmelt patterns. These are details that don't matter much when you've got central heating. But when all you have is turf and instinct, they're the difference between thriving and freezing with your livestock. Now here's a fringe detail. Some archaeological digs have suggested that Viking homes were often clustered in a particular orientation, not just for sun exposure, but possibly due to spiritual beliefs. East-west alignments may have reflected cosmological views or honoured deities. Maybe it was practical, maybe it was religious, maybe it was both. But if your great-great-grandfather's longhouse faced west, chances are yours would too. Even in life or death survival, tradition was rarely ignored. You crouch low near the fire again, thinking about how many generations have huddled in this exact spot. This wasn't the result of guesswork. Families handed down not just land, but knowledge, where the frost comes in first, where the wind whips hardest, where the snow drifts gather like little white death traps. The land was mapped not with ink, but with memory. And then there's the soil. Yes, soil. You wouldn't think dirt matters when everything's frozen, but it does. Sandy or rocky soil drains better, meaning your floors stay drier. Clay-heavy soil? Forget it. Wet, sticky, frozen mud floors are a recipe for trench foot before trench foot was even a thing. Vikings needed soil that could support turf walls, drain excess moisture, and stay structurally sound when frozen. And they figured all this out centuries before the modern science of geotechnical engineering even existed. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much survival was encoded into their culture, passed on like lullabies, told around fires, etched into memory with every frostbitten toe and collapsed roof. Even now, as you feel the logs behind your back and hear the muffled thunder of snow piling up outside, you know this home is here not just because someone liked the view, it's here because it works. There's still debate among historians about how much planning went into site selection versus what was simply inherited. Some argue that Viking families just lived where their ancestors lived. Others point out the clear geographic consistency in how settlements were laid out, facing the sun, hugging terrain, avoiding floodplains. Did they measure? Probably not, but they observed. And when you've survived 20 winters in the same valley, you remember what nearly killed you last time. Outside, the storm is building. You can feel it in the floor, a low, almost subsonic rumble, like the land itself is shivering. You imagine trying to set up a shelter from scratch now, picking the wrong hilltop, the wrong exposure, the wrong everything. And you understand why this process mattered so much. Picking the wrong spot wasn't inconvenient, it was fatal. So you raise your wooden cup again, now filled with something hot and vaguely fishy. Viking soup is a gamble, and you thank whatever gods or instincts your ancestors had that told them. Not here, not that side of the hill, not too close to the stream. You're alive because they got it right. You step outside the longhouse just for a moment and immediately question your life choices. The snow is knee-deep and still falling sideways, as if gravity's gone rogue and the wind now makes all the rules. It smacks your face with icy little slaps while your boots vanish into the white with every step. You'd rather not be out here, but you've got a reason. Today, you're learning why Vikings were picky about what they built on, not just where. At first glance, the ground is just ground. Frozen, hard, covered in snow, and not terribly inviting. But as you crouch and dig a little with your fingers, or more likely a flat iron spade, you quickly realise how deceptive the surface is. Beneath the snow is soil, sure, but not all soil is created equal, and if you just throw up a shelter wherever you happen to be standing, well, good luck waking up tomorrow with a floor that isn't caving in, or a wall that hasn't shifted just enough to collapse when you least expect it. See, the Vikings knew something vital. Frozen ground lies. When frost heaves the soil, expanding and contracting with temperature swings, it doesn't care about your architectural ambitions. If you build directly on top of it without preparing the base, your walls twist, your roof sags, and soon enough your cosy winter refuge becomes a cold, tragic lean-to. So the Vikings had to get clever. They didn't just plop their homes down on whatever flat patch looked promising. They built above the frost. You watch one of the older men from the settlement walk to the edge of the nearby structure, another longhouse in progress, and he gestures for you to look closely. What you see is a carefully layered foundation, large stones arranged in a flat, stable base, forming a kind of footprint for the structure above. The idea was simple: spread the load, keep the building off the worst of the frozen ground, and allow for some drainage underneath. That way the soil could shift all it wanted during the freeze-thaw cycles, but the building? It stayed steady. And here's where it gets clever. In some cases, Vikings used layers of gravel or sand beneath their homes. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but effective. These materials didn't hold water like clay-heavy soils did. Water is the real villain here. It freezes, expands, pushes things upward, and then melts, causing them to sink back unevenly. So creating a buffer layer that allowed moisture to drain away was one of the oldest low-tech versions of frostproofing. Now imagine you're setting up camp in a hurry. Say you're travelling with a group or raiding season is behind you, and you just want a quiet winter hideout. Even then, you wouldn't skip the prep. Temporary shelters still needed some kind of floor treatment. In those cases, Vikings might dig shallow trenches to level out the area, use planks laid across stones, or even pack brush and straw beneath their bedrolls to insulate from the frost. And speaking of quirky, there's one fringe method that still shows up in some archaeological records: seaweed insulation. Along the coasts, some Norse communities use dried seaweed as a base material, both as flooring and even packed into walls. It sounds ridiculous, right? Like building a house out of salad. But dried seaweed is shockingly effective at retaining heat, resisting pests, and handling moisture. Plus, when you live on the coast and your other options are driftwood or more snow, you get creative. The older man pats the foundation stones like they're old friends, and you realise something else. These aren't just functional. They're a kind of wisdom passed on through physical structure. Every stone placed just so tells a story. We built here, we prepared for this, we survived. It's not flashy, but it's sacred in its own quiet way. There's also an ongoing scholarly debate, one that pops up every few years when a new excavation hits the news, about whether Vikings used wooden subfloors in their longhouses. Some reconstructions include them, arguing that a raised wooden floor above the cold ground made too much sense to ignore. Others say, nope, that's a modern fantasy, and most Viking homes had earthen or packed clay floors that were simply covered in straw or rushes to insulate bare feet. The truth is probably somewhere in between, depending on how wealthy you were, what resources you had, and how many winters you'd already survived. Back inside the longhouse, your boots are caked with snow and mud, and the moment you stamp them off, someone hands you a woven mat to help dry them. Not because they care about the floor, but because every drop of moisture that enters the house is an invitation for mould, rot, or that lovely squelching sensation that ruins everyone's mood. Vikings may not have had thermometers or blueprints, but they understood the most important truth of all. Dry is warm, and dry is safe. You take a closer look at the interior now that you're paying attention. The floor isn't fancy, mostly dirt, flattened and packed with layers of straw. It's probably been replaced or refreshed several times over the years. In some houses, wooden planks run through the centre, giving a slightly raised path between the hearth and the sleeping areas. It's not a luxury, it's a way to keep your feet out of the coldest zone. And even though it's dark and smoky and full of people, it's solid. That's what matters. There's also something comforting in the way these homes seem to settle into the earth, not just built on top of it, but with it. The stone footings, the packed soil, the insulation, it's all a dialogue with the landscape. Vikings didn't fight nature with their shelters, they negotiated with it. And part of that negotiation meant knowing when to stay grounded, and when to float just a little above it. You hear someone shout from outside, a warning maybe, or just an update that the storm's picked up again. You can already feel the pressure drop in the room, like the cold itself is trying to find a crack in the walls. But you look at the structure around you, built on its bed of stones and clever drainage, and you know it'll hold. This house has survived winters that would break lesser buildings in a day. You grab a piece of flatbread, now slightly toasted from a skillet over the fire, and take a bite. Outside, the wind roars, but under your feet the foundation is steady, insulated and dry. That's not a coincidence, that's survival, Viking style. The wind hasn't let up, not even for a second. It claws at the roof, presses in at the seams, and makes the walls creak like a ship on a stormy sea. But you're still warm, sort of, warm enough. The fire's burning steadily in the central hearth, and though smoke curls lazily toward the rafters and your eyes still sting a bit, the chill hasn't crept back in. You settle down near one wall, press your palm against it, and that's when you finally get it. This house isn't built of wood. Not really. It's built of earth. It's a turf house, and you are sitting inside what is essentially a grass-covered bunker. Forget whatever cartoon image you might have of Vikings living in timber-framed halls surrounded by deer heads and shouting "Skål" every 5 seconds. Out here, especially in Iceland and rural parts of Norway, timber was a luxury. Trees didn't grow tall and straight in many places, especially not where the ground was more rock than soil, and winters made everything brittle. So the Vikings turned to what they had plenty of: dirt, glorious, damp, grass-packed, root-woven dirt, turf. You look up. You can't even see the turf from inside, of course, because it's layered beneath the roof beams and above the thatch. But the walls, thick, dark and slightly moist in spots, are made entirely from stacked sod bricks. These were cut from the surrounding fields in big rectangular slabs, roots and all. You can picture it. A group of tired but determined Vikings with long-handled knives or turf spades hacking up the earth like they're peeling giant green brownies. Each chunk weighed enough to break a toe if you dropped it wrong, and each one had to be carried, shaped, and carefully stacked. The genius of turf isn't just that it was available, it's that it worked. When layered properly, those sod bricks created walls that could be 3 feet thick. They absorbed heat during the day, what little sunlight existed, and held on to it long into the night. The root systems acted like natural Velcro, binding the bricks together and giving the structure a sort of breathing flexibility. The grass on top, it kept growing, forming a living green roof in spring and summer, and a dense frozen quilt in winter. If it sounds strange, it is, but also genius. And here's a fringe detail that most people don't know. Turf walls actually muffle sound. Inside a turf house during a storm, you hear far less of the chaos outside than you would in a wooden one. The thick walls insulate not just temperature but also noise. It's like being wrapped in a damp earthen hug. Weirdly comforting, if you're into that kind of thing. There's still some debate among archaeologists about how standardised these turf homes were. Some reconstructions show elaborate curved roofs and careful drainage systems, while others suggest many were thrown together in a hurry and just good enough to survive a winter. Did they have blueprints? Of course not. But they had experience, and they had community, and maybe most importantly, they had time. You didn't build a turf house in a day. You spent weeks preparing the land, collecting materials, cutting the sod, layering it with precision. It was a group effort, a family job, sometimes even a village-wide task. Survival in Viking territory was never a solo sport. You run your fingers along the inside of the wall. It's slightly damp, not from leaks, but from condensation. Turf walls breathe. That's both a blessing and a curse. The good news, you don't get as much suffocating humidity as you might with solid wood or stone. The bad news, mould. Yep, mould was a real issue, especially in poorly ventilated turf homes. That's why proper construction included airflow designs, little vents near the eaves, clever positioning of doors, even small high windows, if you were lucky enough to have any at all. And let's be clear, these houses weren't always glamorous. The turf itself would start to slump over time. Roofs sometimes collapsed under heavy snow if not maintained. Inside, insects and critters could burrow their way in if you weren't diligent. Still, for what they had, the Vikings made it work. Some of these structures stood for decades, others, with regular patching and care, even longer. Now here's a moment of weird trivia. In some regions, especially Iceland, turf homes were used into the 20th century. That's right. In a few cases, people lived in turf houses long after the invention of electricity, cars and canned soup. Why? Because they were still warmer and more energy efficient than some early modern housing. There's even a resurgence of interest in these techniques among eco-builders today, who recognise the low carbon footprint and incredible insulation value of grass and dirt architecture. The Vikings were, unintentionally, centuries ahead of their time. You pull your fur cloak tighter as someone throws another log on the fire. A low dog snore ripples through the room, followed by a creak of the roof timbers above. You look up instinctively, but you're not worried. The turf's doing its job. The snow pile's on top, sure, but the house handles it. That heavy weight, it's not a threat, it's extra insulation. And here's another thing. The turf house didn't just keep you alive, it shaped your life. Rooms were dim, small and low. Ceilings forced you to crouch or sit, not pace or stomp. The spaces encouraged communal living, shared warmth, and limited movement. You weren't going to spread out or claim your own wing of the house. Everyone existed in close proximity. Everyone felt winter together. Still, you can't help but admire the engineering. No nails, no concrete, just dirt, grass, wood, stone, and a bit of stubbornness. And yet, here you are, warm enough to feel drowsy, safe enough to close your eyes for a moment, listening to the muffled roar of a storm that might otherwise kill you in a matter of hours. You lean back against the turf wall. It's softer than you expected. Not quite a pillow, but not exactly stone either. The roots beneath the surface form a natural cushion, and though it smells faintly of earth and something like old hay, it doesn't bother you. In fact, it's strangely comforting. The fire crackles. Someone stirs a pot nearby. Maybe stew, maybe porridge, probably something involving fish. It doesn't matter. You're warm, you're dry, you're still here, and you're starting to understand why the Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it. You're lying on your back now, staring up at the beams crisscrossing the ceiling above the hearth. The firelight flickers and dances across the wood, casting shadows that play tricks on your eyes. For a moment it almost feels modern, like some rustic Airbnb trying too hard to be authentic. But then you shift, and your shoulder lands in a cold dip in the floor, and you remember, there's nothing modern about this. This is a Viking longhouse in the middle of winter. There are no backup generators, no hidden thermostat. The warmth you feel is the result of layers, literal, brilliant layers. You're lying inside a thermal sandwich. It doesn't sound glamorous, but it's a lifesaver. The Vikings knew better than to rely on just one material to keep out the cold. Turf alone wouldn't cut it, and wood on its own was a leaky, creaky nightmare. So they layered. Turf, timber, stone, thatch, each played a role. Together they formed a kind of natural insulation system that, centuries later, still works when done right. You sit up and glance toward the wall again. It's a patchwork. The core of the wall is sod, those chunky bricks of grass and earth stacked like brownies, just as you saw earlier. But tucked between those are wooden frames, small sections of horizontal timber that reinforce the structure. And behind those, in some houses, are stone bases, big, flat rocks used to shore up the wall's bottom layer and prevent moisture from creeping upward. Now look overhead. The roof isn't just thatch thrown over a few sticks, it's a multi-layered system, and it's where the magic really happens. First, you've got the supporting beams, made from driftwood or pine or whatever semi-straight lumber the Vikings could get their hands on. Over those go branches or split logs laid side by side, sometimes birch bark for waterproofing, then thick mats of straw or reeds, and finally, in many cases, turf again. That's right, grass on the roof too. Why stop at walls when you can have an entire greenhouse over your head? But why all these layers? Because heat is a fickle thing. It rises, yes, but it also escapes any way it can. And winter doesn't just sit around, it's aggressive. So every layer of material served a unique purpose. Wood provided structure, stone added stability and thermal mass, straw and bark repelled water, turf insulated and held everything down like a heavy frozen blanket. Here's the genius. These layers also breathe. The Vikings didn't build airtight homes, because they couldn't, but also because they shouldn't. Too much trapped moisture leads to mold, rot and lung issues, so instead they relied on passive ventilation. The gaps between materials, intentional or not, allowed airflow, letting smoke out and moisture escape. Your eyes might sting from the fire now and then, but at least your lungs aren't full of mildew. And here's a quirky, underappreciated detail. They often used moss. Yes, moss. Stuff you'd usually scrape off a rock or step over in the woods. But moss was the Viking cork. It was packed into the cracks between logs, stuffed into wall gaps, used to seal the thatch layers above. It's soft, absorbent, and insulates better than you'd think. In a pinch, it even makes a decent bandage. Nature's duct tape, basically. You're starting to see it now. The house isn't one single material or idea, it's a system. Each layer does a job, and no part of the build stands alone. It's the Viking version of synergy, only with fewer meetings and more dirt. And then there's the roof pitch. You duck through the interior again and glance upward, noting the steep angle of the ceiling. It's not just for aesthetics. That angle is calculated, well, instinctively at least, to shed snow quickly. A roof too flat would collapse under the weight of heavy snowdrifts. Too steep, and you lose all that precious insulating turf. Vikings found the Goldilocks angle, steep enough to let the snow slide, but stable enough to stack layers of insulation and withstand the wind. There's an ongoing academic debate, by the way, about how standardized Viking roof construction really was. Some reconstructions argue that certain communities, especially those further inland, used more timber-heavy roofs with double thatch systems. Others say that was rare and the layered turf and thatch model was more widespread. The truth, as usual, probably depends on the region, the resources, and whether the local chieftain insisted on his roof looking fancier than the neighbours. Another detail you probably wouldn't expect: some Viking roofs were rebuildable. Rather than constructing them to last for decades unchanged, they designed them to be easily patched or replaced when needed. If the top layers of turf eroded, or if a storm ripped off part of the thatch, they'd just replace those sections. It wasn't negligence, it was maintenance. The house lived and breathed like the people inside. You took care of it, or it failed you. Simple as that. You stretch your legs, your feet just brushing the edge of a bed platform. Nothing more than a raised plank covered in straw, maybe with a fur throw if you're lucky. The cold air gathers low in the room, which is why raised platforms were so crucial. Heat rises, remember? And in a space like this, every inch of elevation makes a difference. The layers above you are working together to trap that heat, like a soft bubble just under the ceiling. You sit in that warmth, surrounded by stone, wood, turf, straw, and moss. And for the first time today, you're not shivering. Someone moves past you, brushing aside a hanging textile that serves as a makeshift door to the next room. Another layer. Vikings hung woolen curtains or animal hides over doorways inside the house, especially in longhouses with separate compartments. Not for privacy, really, for warmth. Each layer of fabric slowed airflow, held in heat, and helped keep the cold confined to where it belonged: outside. It all comes back to this concept. Don't fight nature, layer against it. The cold will always find a way in. Your job is to make that journey as slow and difficult as possible. The Vikings didn't have insulation charts or thermal cameras, but they had generations of trial and error. And those hard-earned lessons, pile it, patch it, insulate it, layer it, were literally built into every home. You settle back again, body pressed into the layers of your own. Wool tunic, fur cloak, linen shirt, another woolen layer underneath. You're just another part of the insulation system. One more human radiator adding heat to the space. The structure holds it, cradles it, multiplies it through layers and design. The storm rages on, but inside your layered shell of stone, turf, straw and stubbornness, you're safe and warm, for now. You're barely through your first cup of weak, smoky ale when someone motions for you to follow them outside again. You groan. You were just getting warm, but you know better than to argue. So you pull on your fur-lined boots, wrap that itchy wool cloak tighter around your shoulders, and brace yourself as the door creaks open. The cold smacks your face immediately, sharp and merciless, but this time you notice something else. The wind that had howled so violently just minutes ago, it's not as bad out here. The storm's still doing its thing, whiteout conditions, snow piling up like bad decisions, but the area around the house is strangely still, like you've stepped into a little protected pocket, and then it clicks. The longhouse isn't just a building, it's been tucked, half submerged into the landscape. It doesn't sit on the land, it sinks into it. The floor of the house is actually a few feet below the surface, and the walls rise just above the snowdrifts. From a distance, the whole thing might look like a weirdly shaped hill. From up close, you can see how brilliant it is. This isn't accidental. This is intentional, thoughtful architecture designed to survive the worst the North has to offer. This is the Viking version of going underground. Semi-subterranean shelters, homes partially dug into the earth, weren't just an emergency fallback or last resort. In many places, especially where timber was scarce, or the wind was particularly brutal, it was standard practice. You dig down just a bit, enough to anchor the structure and use the earth itself as insulation. Dirt doesn't get as cold as air in winter, and it doesn't fluctuate as wildly in temperature. It's stable, consistent, and best of all, windproof. You follow your guide around the house and realize that the mound you're walking on, that's not just a roof, it's a part of the structure. The home has been built into the slope of the land. The rear wall is actually just the hill itself, shaped and reinforced with turf blocks. The front half is more visibly constructed, with low stone walls and a heavy wooden door that faces away from the prevailing winds. It's clever, it's calculated. It's the architectural equivalent of curling up in a tight ball when you're cold. Make yourself small, reduce surface exposure, and let the world rage around you. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some of these semi-dug homes use the removed earth to build up windbreaks around the entrance. Literally, the Vikings weaponized the hole they dug, and if they were settling in for the long haul, they'd dig out drainage ditches or sump pits around the foundation to keep snowmelt from seeping in. It wasn't perfect, Nothing ever is when you're building with dirt and guesswork, but it kept floors drier and gave the home a slightly raised platform inside. That extra elevation? Warmth insurance. You head back in, brushing the snow off your boots again at the threshold, and take a fresh look at the interior. You hadn't noticed before, but the house is built on a gentle slope. The entrance sits higher than the hearth, and the far end of the longhouse is slightly sunken. That slope serves two key purposes. It funnels smoke toward the vent at the top of the roof, and, more importantly, it helps moisture drain naturally toward the lowest point. The Vikings didn't need elaborate plumbing systems. They just let gravity and elevation do the work. Some scholars still debate whether this kind of semi-subterranean construction was reserved for poorer households, those without access to good timber, or whether it was actually the preferred method in certain regions. In Iceland, for example, the turf house became so central to rural life that even wealthier families lived in them, expanding and improving them with more complex layouts, but keeping that core principle: build with the earth, not just on it. There's even evidence that Viking-age settlers in Greenland used this strategy almost exclusively. The climate there was even harsher, the wind colder, the timber non-existent, so they dug deep. They built entire homesteads half below the surface, using stone and turf in intricate layers, even incorporating old ship timbers when they had them. Some of these shelters were so well insulated that people could sit indoors during the dead of winter with only a single fire to warm the entire family. Not comfortably, mind you, but livably. And here's the part that might just blow your mind. In some cases, the semi-subterranean homes weren't just insulated by turf and soil. They were insulated by snow. That's right. Snow, which you probably think of as cold and miserable, is actually a shockingly good insulator. Once a home was buried under a few feet of snow, it retained even more warmth. The roof had to be strong, of course, and maintained constantly to prevent collapse. But that snowy crust, it was the Viking version of double glazing. Back inside, the fire crackles as someone stokes it with a fresh log. You glance at the walls again, realizing how much of what you assumed was just dirt is actually structural genius. The walls feel like part of the earth. The temperature, while still cool by modern standards, is steady. You've stopped shivering. Your nose isn't running. That annoying ache in your toes has finally eased up. And this is where the house begins to feel more than just protective. It feels alive. The earth expands and contracts with the seasons. The roof collects snow, then sheds it. The walls breathe moisture in and out. Even the floor changes throughout the year, softening in summer, hardening in winter. You're not just in a building. You're part of a seasonal, adaptive, evolving system. You settle near the hearth again and someone brings you a wooden bowl of hot something. It's a stew, you think. Fish, root vegetables, probably dried herbs. You sip slowly. It's oddly good. Or maybe you're just starving. Either way, it warms you from the inside, just like the fire and the structure around you warm you from the outside. The storm continues its tantrum outside, but the wind doesn't touch you here. The snow piles against the walls, but it only strengthens them. The entrance is low, the roof is buried, and the cold has been pushed back inch by inch by a design so ancient it feels like a secret, and yet it's been hiding in plain sight all along. This house was never meant to dominate the land. It was meant to vanish into it. That was the real Viking power, knowing that survival didn't come from conquering nature, but from becoming part of it. The morning after the storm is oddly silent. Snow lies thick and heavy across the landscape, muffling sound and turning everything into a frozen dreamscape. The wind has stopped, for now, and the grey sky hangs low, sagging over the hills like a tired wool blanket. Inside the longhouse, it's warmer than you expect. Not cosy exactly, but stable. You can move without shivering. You can breathe without seeing your breath. And you know it's not just the fire that made that happen. It's the house itself, holding the heat like a jealous dragon guarding treasure. And that's when someone mentions wood. You blink. Wood? You haven't seen much of it. A few support beams here, a post or two near the entrance, some charred logs by the hearth. But the house, as you've seen, is mostly earth and turf. So where's the rest? The answer is simple. There isn't any, not much anyway. And that's because in many parts of the Viking world, wood was a luxury. Forget the image of endless dark forests and Viking lumberjacks swinging axes with heroic flair. In places like Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Norway, tall, straight trees were rare. The terrain was rocky, windswept, and in many places deforested long before the Vikings arrived. Timber was used sparingly, reserved for where it mattered most, and when you lived in a place where winter could kill you faster than starvation, every scrap of wood had to count. So when you do find wood in a Viking shelter, it's playing a starring role. Support beams, heavy central timbers carved from driftwood or scavenged pine, are the backbone of the roof. They hold everything up. These beams were often reused, passed down, repurposed from old buildings or shipwrecks. Nothing went to waste. A single good beam might outlive generations. You can almost imagine it. Some kid in 900 AD playing under the same roof timber that once held up his grandfather's house. That's not just recycling, it's ancestral architecture. The walls, as you've seen, are mostly turf, but they're usually framed with vertical posts at intervals. These posts, often called staves, create a kind of skeleton for the sod to cling to. Think of it like a primitive stud wall, only instead of drywall you're packing it with dirt and grass. In wealthier homes, or in regions where wood was more available, these posts were part of a post and beam framework, with horizontal timbers laid across the top to help support the roof and distribute weight. In poorer homes, you might get one or two good posts and the rest filled in with stone, bone or whatever didn't collapse under pressure. And then there's the roof, arguably the most dangerous, delicate part of the whole structure. Without the proper support, it collapses under the weight of snow, turf and time. So Vikings used as little wood as they could get away with, but placed it precisely. Ridge beams ran along the length of the house, propped up by paired posts like ribs on a spine. Over those came rafters, spaced evenly and angled to match the pitch of the roof. Then came the thatch, the turf, or both. Minimal wood, maximum effect. Here's something weird and wonderful. Sometimes Vikings used their ships as parts of their shelters, literally. When they weren't raiding, some seafarers would drag their boats inland, flip them upside down, and turn them into makeshift shelters. The curved hull made a perfect roof shape, and the timbers were already expertly crafted. In Iceland, where timber was almost non-existent, settlers even dismantled boats and used the wood for longhouse beams. You weren't just building a house, you were rebuilding a ship into one. There's also a subtle political layer to all this. Wood signified wealth. If your longhouse had multiple rooms with distinct wooden partitions, or intricately carved beams in the ceiling, or, gasp, a wooden floor, that said something. You weren't just surviving winter, you were flourishing through it. You had the resources, the manpower, the prestige. So yes, the walls might be turf and the roof covered in moss, but a single ornate beam could declare your social status louder than any feast or sword ever could. And of course, there's the matter of firewood. You need it. Constantly. The central hearth is your lifeline, but Vikings didn't use construction-quality timber to burn. They relied on brushwood, driftwood, peat, dried dung, whatever would catch and hold a flame without wasting precious logs. And when trees were cut down, the process was deliberate. No casual tree felling here. You only harvested what you needed, and when you needed it. Waste was deadly. Some archaeologists argue that the scarcity of wood in Viking settlements may have even limited their population growth in certain regions. No timber, no new homes, no new families. Others suggest it forced a more communal living model, multiple generations under one roof, sharing a hearth, sharing a structure, sharing the burden of staying alive. Again, the shelter wasn't just a structure, it was a social system. You trace your fingers along one of the support beams now, noticing the weathered grain and rough tool marks. It's not elegant, but it's strong, still holding after who knows how many winters. The beam smells faintly of smoke, soaked into its core after years of open fire beneath it. There's a darkened crack in the centre, maybe from one particularly cold season, but it's been bound with a leather strap, old but functional. Vikings didn't have epoxy or sealants, but they had muscle and ingenuity. And speaking of quirks, in some regions Vikings believed certain types of wood carried spiritual significance. Yew, for example, was considered sacred. Ash, associated with the world tree Yggdrasil, might have symbolic weight in construction, though to be fair it was also just great for making handles and tools. Did they actually build houses with spiritual trees? That's debated. But even the belief adds another layer to how Vikings saw their materials not just as resources but as living, meaningful parts of their world. Back at the hearth, you lean close to the fire again and listen to the creaking above. It's not unsettling, it's familiar, almost comforting. The wood overhead groans a little, settling under the weight of snow and time, but it holds. Because even in a world made of turf and stone and frost, a few well-placed pieces of timber make all the difference. You sip your drink again, stronger now, thank Odin, and wonder how many lives this house has held, how many storms it's weathered, how many generations slept under this beam, listened to that wind, stared into this same fire. The wood may be minimal, but it's sacred. It's the skeleton of the shelter. And like a skeleton, it's what keeps everything else from collapsing. By now you've figured out that nothing in this Viking shelter is accidental. Not the turf walls, not the tucked-in location, not even the smell of smoke that seems to linger in everything like some ancient cologne. But as the wind picks up again and a new layer of snow hisses across the roof, someone leads you outside once more. They're headed toward the edge of the farmstead, where a newer structure is being built. It's low, blocky, and unlike the turf-covered longhouse you just left, this one is made almost entirely from stone. Yes, stone. No, not the pristine cut and polished kind you might imagine in Roman ruins or Gothic castles. This is raw, uneven, misshapen rock, gathered from the surrounding land and stacked with all the elegance of a drunk man's game of Jenga. But still it stands, and more importantly it insulates. Stone's not warm. That's the first thing you realise as you run your fingers along the outside wall. It's cold to the touch, even though the sun's doing its weak best to peek through the clouds. And yet, when you duck inside the half-built structure, something changes. The wind disappears. The air is still. There's no turf roof yet, no fire burning, but even without all that, the stone offers a strange kind of silence and solidity. You can feel how it holds the world at bay. Vikings didn't use stone in every home. In fact, it was rare in many parts of Scandinavia, where the soil was better suited to turf and wood was at least somewhat available. But in Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes, and parts of northern Scotland, stone was abundant. And that made all the difference. Timber might rot, turf might collapse, but stone? Stone endures. It wasn't glamorous work. You can picture it. Men hauling rocks up hillsides, slipping on snow, muttering curses in Old Norse while trying to balance slabs of basalt into some kind of functional wall. No mortar, no cement. Just weight and gravity, carefully placed and corrected until the whole thing locked together like an ancient puzzle. And here's the genius part. They didn't try to fight the coldness of stone. They used it. Stone holds thermal mass. That means once it gets warm, it stays warm. Not for long, mind you, unless it's insulated, but in a well-designed structure, with turf packed around the outside and heat rising from within, those stone walls slowly absorb the warmth of the hearth and release it back into the space overnight. You're basically sitting inside a giant battery made of rock and fire. And here's a fringe fact. Some Viking homes built with stone used double wall construction. That's right. 2 layers of stone, with turf, sand, or even moss stuffed in between. Think of it like a primitive, very heavy version of double-pane glass. The outer wall took the brunt of the wind and snow, the middle layer absorbed and slowed the cold, the inner wall stayed relatively warm and stable. Smart, right? The only downside, if you messed up your measurements, you'd spend the next few months rebuilding everything after the first heavy snowfall brought it crashing down. You crouch near the corner of the building site where someone is wedging smaller rocks into gaps between larger ones, adjusting the pressure and alignment by feel alone. There's no level, no tape measure, no architectural plan, just experience, just hands that remember. The way the rocks are shaped, the way the walls angle slightly inward at the top, the way snow slides off the side walls rather than collecting dangerously, it's all done by instinct sharpened by necessity. There's ongoing debate among archaeologists about how common full stone houses were during the Viking Age. Some argue they were mostly used for outbuildings, storage sheds, animal pens, seasonal shelters, while others believe that entire homes, especially in more remote regions, were regularly built from stone with turf-packed roofs. The evidence is tricky. Wood rots, turf disappears, stone is what remains. So we may actually overestimate how dominant stone was simply because it leaves the most behind. But it's also true that when stone was used, it was used with purpose. Some ruins in Greenland show complex layouts, multi-room homes, corridors, even indoor benches and storage niches, all carved or stacked from stone. These weren't thrown together. They were crafted with attention to airflow, light, what little of it there was, and human movement inside the space. Even today, visiting some of these ruins, you can still feel the structure of the lives that once filled them. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps on those frozen floors. And here's a quirky thing. Stone walls often outlasted the people who built them. Generations would rebuild turf roofs over the same ancient stone base, patching and layering until the house became a kind of physical family tree. You could trace your lineage not through scrolls or portraits, but through walls, where your grandfather added a new room, where your great-aunt sealed off a leaky corner. A house wasn't just a shelter, it was a legacy. Back inside the main longhouse, where your seat by the fire is waiting, you start to notice the details you missed before. That low stone wall under the window slit. It's not just decorative. It anchors the corner of the structure and redirects runoff from the melting snow above. That stone step near the entrance. It's been worn smooth by decades, maybe centuries, of muddy boots, frost-covered soles, and the occasional goat hoof. And just to make things more interesting, some Vikings carved protective runes into their stone thresholds. Whether for luck, divine protection, or just good old-fashioned superstition, they believed these markings could keep bad things, spirits, storms, enemies, out of the home. There's no hard proof it worked, but hey, you're still alive. Maybe it helped. The fire crackles again. Someone's roasting something unidentifiable on a spit. Could be rabbit, could be fish, could be a weirdly shaped root. You don't care. The smell is earthy and good. You lean back, letting the warmth soak into your bones, and feel the presence of the stone walls around you. Silent, ancient, unmoving. They've seen storms worse than this, and they'll still be here when this one passes. You wake up to the sound of dripping, steady, rhythmic, and mildly ominous. For a moment you panic. A leak, a hole in the roof, a slow disaster melting its way through your ceiling and onto your head. But then you remember, this is a Viking shelter. Nothing leaks by accident. The sound isn't water falling from some failure in the design. It's snowmelt running down the thatch, sliding off the turf roof just as it's supposed to. Nature managed. Barely. You sit up and stretch, the stiffness in your back reminding you that Viking sleeping arrangements were never meant to compete with memory foam. The air is still cool but breathable. Your nose isn't frozen, your toes aren't numb, and that's saying something. Because as you glance upward, you get a better look at the real crown of the Viking home, the roof. If the walls are the bones of the shelter, then the roof is the skin. It covers everything, protects it, and, if you're clever, helps regulate the temperature inside with surprising grace. Today's roof is a thatched one. You've seen turf-covered roofs already, thick and blanketed with dirt and roots, but this one is different. Lighter, made from bundles of straw or reeds tied tightly together, and layered so precisely it might as well be scale armour for a house. Thatched roofing wasn't just a poor man's solution, it was a strategic masterpiece. It was breathable, repairable, and, most importantly, it repelled water. Lay the bundles with the right pitch, and water simply slides down the surface, never penetrating more than a few inches. Lay it wrong, and well, you've got soup dripping on your bedding. And in a Viking winter, that's the start of a very short, very soggy death spiral. Someone climbs up the side of the house with a ladder, carrying a bundle of straw under one arm. You watch them climb like it's no big deal, even though the entire roof is frozen and probably death slick. They reach a worn patch near the edge and start lashing new bundles in place. No nails, no screws, just split wood pegs, thin rope, and technique. And that's the beauty of thatching. Anyone can do it, with the right materials and enough patience. In fact, it's so DIY friendly that it's still practiced in parts of rural Scandinavia today, with some roofs lasting 30 to 40 years between major repairs. Now here's the fringe bit. Thatched roofs weren't just insulation, they were status. The tighter the weave, the finer the material, the longer the overhangs, the more skilled the builder. A good thatched roof wasn't just warm, it was bragging rights. You could walk into someone's home and know immediately if they were the kind of Viking who cut corners, or the kind who had his act together. Inside, you glance up again. There's no ceiling per se, just beams and rafters, the underside of the thatch visible through the crosshatch of supporting wood. Smoke from the hearth still curls upward, finding its way through tiny gaps in the roof. There's a vent at the top, a simple hole, not exactly a chimney, and it lets out just enough smoke to keep the room breathable without letting all the heat escape. This system isn't perfect. Sometimes, especially on days when the wind dies or shifts, the smoke hangs too low. Your eyes sting, your throat burns. but you'd still rather cough than freeze. There's an academic debate still brewing, pun intended, about whether Vikings intentionally built their roofs to filter smoke through the thatch. Some believe the slow release of smoke helped preserve the straw and keep pests away, while others argue it was just an unavoidable side effect of an open hearth and a lack of modern ventilation. But one thing everyone agrees on: the roof mattered. In the coldest months, it was the thin line between shelter and exposure. And remember that snow you were worried about? Turns out it's part of the system. When snow piles up on a thatched or turf roof, it actually adds insulation. It's counterintuitive, but snow traps heat, so long as the structure beneath it is strong enough to hold the weight. A good Viking roof wasn't just about shedding water, it was about balancing protection and insulation. Some snow was good. Too much snow meant disaster. That's why roofs were designed with a steep pitch, often between 45 and 60 degrees. This angle lets snow slide off in manageable layers, while also channeling rain and meltwater away from the walls. In places with heavier snowfall, the pitch was even steeper, turning some homes into angular, almost triangular beasts designed to shake off winter like a dog shaking off water. Now let's talk fire, the elephant in the room, or rather, the very real fire hazard above your head. Dry straw, open flame. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, more than you'd like. Fires did happen, but Vikings weren't careless. Roofs were often treated, or at least seasoned, to resist burning. Smoke slowly curing the thatch over years actually made it less flammable. And hearths were built low and contained, with fire pits ringed in stone and raised edges to keep embers from leaping into the rafters. Still, accidents happened. Entire villages have burned to the ground because someone got too casual with the fire. One legend tells of a wedding feast that ended in catastrophe when a drunken guest knocked over a torch, setting the thatch ablaze. Whether it's true or not, the moral stuck: respect the roof. You press your palm against one of the wooden beams now, feeling how warm it is just beneath the surface. Heat has crept upward and settled there, just like it was supposed to. Above it, the straw does its job silently, holding warmth in and letting moisture out. And here's one last quirky fact for the night. Some Norse households use their thatched roofs for storage, not inside them, on top. In spring and summer, you'd find fish laid out to dry along the southern slope, herbs tied in bunches and hung from the eaves, even sheepskins stretched out to cure. The roof wasn't just overhead, it was useful real estate, a productive surface, a working part of the household economy. As night creeps in and the fire burns low again, you lie back down and stare at that ceiling one more time. It's not fancy, it's not polished, but it's alive. It breathes, it bends, it sheds rain and snow, channels smoke, stores heat, and somehow, despite its humble ingredients, keeps you alive through the worst nature has to offer. Above your head, the wind picks up again. Snow begins to fall heavier, but you don't worry, not tonight, because that roof has your back. You wake to a haze of smoke hanging lazily above your head, like an unwanted guest that overstayed its welcome. The hearth fire is down to embers, but there's still enough heat lingering in the stones to make your breath come out in short, visible bursts. Less like you're freezing to death, more like you're living in a smoked sausage. You blink the sting from your eyes, sit up slowly, and take in the full sensory assault of Viking morning. Wool sweat, damp straw, wood smoke, and something bubbling ominously in a pot that smells like fish and regret. And yet, somehow, it works. You're still warm. Mostly. Your fingers haven't turned blue, and the layer of frost that once clung to the inner walls has receded. The inside of this place has a lived-in warmth now, dense and slow like a stew simmering over a low flame. But that doesn't mean everything's comfortable, not by a long shot. Because the thing keeping you alive right now, the same thing that's toasting your toes and curing your meat and making your stew taste slightly like ash, it's also trying to kill you. Welcome to the delicate, smoky dance of Viking indoor fire. The hearth is the heart of the house, always has been. In a Viking longhouse, it sits right in the middle. Open, simple, no chimney, just a pit in the floor ringed by stones and lined with ash. You can't miss it. Not just because of the fire, but because of what surrounds it. Benches, beds, drying racks, cooking tools, and every single person in the building trying to soak up as much warmth as they can. There's no living room. This is the living. And the dying, if you're not careful. There's a reason no one falls asleep too close to the hearth. embers population, wood shifts, sparks fly. And while the roof above is made of dried grass, sticks, and some hope, the line between cosy and crispy is dangerously thin. But the Vikings, smart as they were stubborn, didn't just throw logs on a fire and call it good. Fire was treated with a sort of reverent caution. It was tended constantly. Someone was always responsible for it. If the fire went out, relighting it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a full-blown crisis. In winter, fire meant life. Without it, your meat spoiled, your fingers froze, and your morale dropped into the pit along with the last unburned log. So instead of letting that happen, the hearth was never left alone. Even when everyone was asleep, someone kept an eye on the coals, raking them gently, feeding in small pieces of peat, or kindling to keep them smouldering through the night. And yes, peat. In places where wood was scarce, dried peat bricks cut from marshlands served as fuel. They burned slower, longer, and stinkier than wood, but they worked. You could survive a winter on peat alone if you had enough and didn't mind smelling like a swampy fire pit. Now here's where things get spicy, literally. Viking hearths weren't just for heat, they were multifunctional. You cooked over them, yes, but you also dried herbs, smoked meat, sterilized tools, boiled water, heated rocks for bathing, or pretending to bathe, and even brewed rudimentary mead or ale in big, soot-blackened kettles. The fire was part kitchen, part furnace, part holy shrine. In fact, it was sacred in a lot of homes. Some families believed household spirits, known as landvetir or disser, dwelt near the hearth. Offerings of fat, bread, or even a splash of precious mead might be dropped into the flames during rituals or special nights. The fire wasn't just for survival, it was for protection. You didn't curse at it, you didn't spit into it, and you definitely didn't ignore it. Not unless you wanted bad luck, or worse. But let's be real, the open fire setup wasn't exactly healthy. Living in a Viking longhouse was like camping with smoke inhalation as a lifestyle. The roof vent above the hearth let some of the smoke out, but a lot of it just hung there, collecting in the upper half of the room. You get used to it, they say. But used to it still includes coughing fits, watery eyes, and long-term respiratory problems. Modern researchers studying Viking remains have found evidence of soot-lined lungs and damage consistent with smoke exposure. So yeah, coziness had a cost. Now here's the weird part. Some homes didn't have any real roof vent at all, just gaps where smoke eventually found its way out. The slow accumulation of smoke would form a layer across the ceiling, drifting around until it seeped through the thatch or escaped through door cracks and structural imperfections. Was it comfortable? Absolutely not. Did it work? Kind of. And believe it or not, there was a small upside to all this passive smoking. It preserved the house. All that smoke in the rafters, it chased off insects. It kept mould at bay. It dried the thatch and sealed the wood, preventing rot. Some historians think this unintentional curing process is part of why certain Viking buildings lasted so long. Smoke was the house's immune system. Annoying for the people, but great for the roof. And let's not forget the visual hazard. Picture this. You're fumbling around in the half-dark, half-smoke, trying to find a mug or a ladle or a wool sock, and you're tripping over sleeping relatives ducking low beams, and nearly sitting on a goat that no one remembered was inside. All because the fire is doing its job, but also making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. That's probably why everything important was kept close to the ground. Tools, food, children, drying racks, anything you didn't want to lose or accidentally set on fire. You learn quickly to crawl before you walk, especially during long smoky nights where even a spark landing wrong could mean rebuilding your entire life. You lie back now, propped on one elbow, staring up through the thin grey veil of smoke. It swirls softly, catching the glow of the hearth and making the rafters seem further away than they really are. It's beautiful in a way, like watching clouds drift through your ceiling. You can see why the fire became something more than just practical. It was mesmerizing, constant, alive. The room is quieter now. Most people are asleep again, curled up under cloaks or pressed together on shared bedding. The fire crackles low, just enough to take the edge off the cold creeping in through the floor, and you realize this smoky, flickering heart of the house, with all its discomfort and danger, works. It's messy, it's imperfect, but it's the reason the walls are still standing, the food is still cooking, and your breath is still warm. And for the Vikings, that was enough. you're starting to notice something that you hadn't fully grasped before, not in the beams or the walls, or even the carefully layered turf. It's in the bodies. All of them. They're everywhere. Sleeping side by side, huddled under shared blankets, packed onto raised platforms lying shoulder to shoulder, knees overlapping. Even the dog is curled up on someone's feet. You barely have room to stretch, and you're pretty sure at some point during the night someone used your thigh as a pillow and then rolled away like nothing happened. Personal space? Never heard of her, and that honestly is part of the survival strategy. Because when it comes to staying warm during a Viking blizzard, all the turf and timber in the world isn't worth much without the final, most stubbornly biological heat source of them all: other people. Welcome to the warmth in numbers principle, the original Viking central heating system. It's not glamorous, but it is undeniably effective. You huddle together, you share your body heat, and you hope no one snores directly into your ear. Communal sleeping was the norm, not the exception. In fact, the very design of the longhouse practically requires it. Open floor plan, limited fuel, and insulation that can only do so much. All of it encourages a lifestyle that brings people close, not an acute sitcom way. In a survival is more important than modesty kind of way. Children, parents, grandparents, cousins, even visiting guests. Everyone shares space when it's below freezing outside and your only real heater is a flickering fire and the squishy human radiator next to you. You glance over at a couple of children squashed together under a heavy sheepskin blanket, their faces red from the heat of the fire but their fingers still twitching with the cold. Beside them, a grandmother is snoring with her mouth open, one slipper half fallen off. There's no privacy, no boundaries. You sleep where there's space. If you want to keep your warmth, you learn to deal with elbows in your ribs and the occasional stinky foot dangerously close to your face. And here's where the social fabric starts to look a lot like literal fabric, woven together tight. You're not just staying alive by sharing heat, you're reinforcing bonds. In a place where winter isolates families for weeks or months at a time, that closeness becomes your mental and emotional insulation too. You fight less when you can't escape each other. You talk more when there's nothing else to do. You learn to accept quirks, to forgive snoring, to ignore smells that would probably make a weaker soul weep. Now here's a fun fringe fact. Archaeologists have found evidence that in some longhouses, livestock also slept inside, right there in the same structure. Not loose, obviously. There were partitions or separate areas, but still inside the protective heat-sharing shell of the home. Cows, goats, sheep, chickens, the whole gang. Their body heat added to the internal temperature, and in exchange they got shelter from the storm. Win-win. Until someone stepped in something barefoot on their way to the fire, and there's a certain logic to this multi-species sleepover. One cow can generate as much body heat as several humans. Keep the animals on the lower end of a sloped floor, and the heat rises up toward the human sleeping platforms. Smart, right? Smelly but smart. There are even records of households building longhouses with stables attached directly to the human living quarters, like a two-room cabin where the back room moves. This kind of communal warmth wasn't just physical, it was strategic. Imagine what would happen if everyone had their own room, or even their own bed. You'd need more fuel, more space, more materials, and you'd lose the efficiency of shared heat. So the layout of the house, central hearth, clustered beds, low ceiling, wasn't an accident. It was a calculated equation. Minimum space, maximum survival. Of course, it wasn't all peace and togetherness. Imagine trying to sleep while someone's coughing 3 feet from your face, or a baby's screaming, or the fire pops and throws ash all over your blanket. Winter sleep in a Viking longhouse wasn't peaceful. It was practical. You got rest in bursts. You adjusted constantly. You learned to sleep in the noise, in the smell, in the crush of humanity that made survival possible. There's also a fascinating debate among historians about how these shared sleeping arrangements shaped Viking culture. Did the lack of privacy foster tighter communities? Did it increase empathy? Or did it just make everyone really, really good at ignoring each other? Some even argue that communal sleeping laid the foundation for Viking democratic assemblies. When you're used to sharing your space, you get better at sharing your voice. You reposition yourself near the hearth again, trying not to disturb the pile of limbs beside you. Someone groans and rolls over. Another person sneezes directly into the wool blanket. And still, you're warm. Somehow, amid the mess, the noise, and the human clutter, you're warmer than you were at any other point in the day, And not just in the body, in the brain too. Because that's the hidden truth about Viking survival. It wasn't just about outsmarting the cold. It was about not letting it break you, not just physically, but mentally. Long winters, endless darkness, the howling wind outside threatening to claw through your walls at any moment, it wears on you. If you were alone, it would crush you, but you're not. You're surrounded, literally, emotionally, and that's the point. You think back to stories you've heard, about Viking warriors and explorers braving the elements alone, surviving off snow and squirrel meat, running shirtless through blizzards like some Nordic fever dream. And then you look around at this scene. People tangled together in sleep, firelight flickering across soot-darkened faces, someone muttering in their dreams, the dog whimpering softly in its sleep, and you realise this is what survival really looked like. Not heroic, not solitary, but crowded, messy, human. You close your eyes again, pulling your blanket up to your chin. Someone's elbow presses into your side. Another person is definitely snoring louder than should be physically possible, but the fire's still going. The roof is holding, and in this pile of body heat, half-cooked food and shared breath, you realise something truly wild. You're comfortable. Sometime before dawn, you're awakened not by the cold, or the wind, or even the relentless snoring, but by a quiet, deliberate rustling near the hearth. Someone's moving in the dark. You sit up slowly, half draped in your wool blanket, and catch the flicker of firelight against a form crouched near the coals. She's layering kindling onto the embers, coaxing a new flame to life with the kind of skill that only comes from years of waking up before everyone else and getting the warmth going before the house starts to freeze again. No fuss, no fanfare, just necessity. But what catches your eye isn't her quiet efficiency, it's what she's wearing. Layers. So many layers. She's bundled in a thick woolen tunic worn soft and heavy by time, with another one over the top, darker, coarser. A fur-lined cloak sits on her shoulders, the edges singed from years of too close contact with open flame. Her legs are wrapped in woven bands, crisscrossing down to her ankles where leather shoes are stuffed with something, moss, maybe, or wool scraps, to keep out the cold. Even her hands are swaddled in mitt-style gloves, fur side in. You suddenly realise that the architecture around you isn't the only thing keeping everyone alive. The shelter may hold the wind at bay, but it's the clothing that turns the tide in the quiet war against winter. Because Viking clothing wasn't fashion, it was infrastructure, and you, my friend, are underdressed. You fumble for your outer layer, pulling on your own wool tunic which now smells faintly like smoke and goat. The air in the longhouse is cooling again. It always does around this time, when the fire's low and the cold starts to press its fingers through the cracks. So you add another layer, and then another. No one here's trying to look good. They're trying to trap body heat like it's the last gold coin in the kingdom. The base layer, always linen, lightweight, breathable, and surprisingly good at wicking away moisture. You might think sweating is the least of your problems in sub-zero temperatures, but trust, sweat is a death sentence in winter. Wet fabric sucks the heat from your body faster than standing outside naked. So, the linen keeps your skin dry. Over that comes wool, layered and looped, sometimes doubled up at the chest and shoulders. The outermost garments are rougher, heavier. These are the shields against wind and snow. You'll see cloaks made from tightly woven wool, sometimes felted, sometimes lined with fur if you're lucky. These cloaks are fastened with brooches or simple leather ties, functional, adjustable, and quick to throw off if you get too close to the fire and start to smoulder. Now here's where it gets quirky. Vikings didn't just wear their clothes, they engineered them. Those leg wraps, they weren't fashion-forward accessories. They helped insulate the calves, protected the shins from the wind, and even reinforced weak shoes. Wrapping them in a spiral from knee to ankle, the overlapping pattern kept warmth in and snow out. And if they got wet, unwrap, dry near the fire, wrap again. Everything was modular. Swap pieces, layer smartly, adapt constantly. And let's not forget the hoods. Oh, the hoods. A simple wool hood with a shoulder-length cape could be the difference between a long walk to the barn and a long walk to your frozen grave. Covering the head was crucial, not just for warmth, but because heat loss from the scalp and neck could cripple your internal temperature in a matter of minutes. Hats, too, were a given. Pointed wool caps, fur-lined leather, or just a tightly wrapped scarf. Whatever worked. It's around this time that someone else stirs and pulls themselves upright, eyes bleary, already reaching for their boots. You get a closer look at the footwear in question. Leather stitched by hand, soft-soled and pliable, but stuffed with insulating material. If it's winter, those shoes are lined with fur, moss, or even hay. Some even had a double-layer design, inner slipper and outer shoe, like the distant ancestor of the snow boot. Was it waterproof? Not really, but it kept the worst of the wet at bay long enough to get the job done. There's a heated scholarly debate over just how advanced Viking textile technology actually was. Some argue they were primitive, relying solely on brute layering and rough materials. Others point to archaeological finds, intricately woven textiles, dyed threads, even traces of silk in high-status graves, as evidence that Vikings were textile nerds, not just brutes in fur. The truth probably sits in the middle. Most people wore practical, sturdy clothes, but the art of weaving was alive and well, especially among women, who often passed down looms and techniques through generations. And speaking of weaving, the people making these clothes weren't just domestic drudges. Textile work was a respected and essential part of the household economy. A well-made cloak was worth as much as a weapon. A skilled weaver was as vital as a blacksmith. And the tools? Simple but brilliant. Weighted looms, spindle whorls, carders, all used to turn raw wool into warmth, one painstaking strand at a time. You glance around the room again. Everyone's wearing some combination of the same basic pieces, but no two outfits are identical. Some are patched beyond recognition. Others are clearly heirlooms, the weave tighter, the dye deeper. You see one man wrap his cloak around a child and then immediately pull on another, smaller one from a pile near the bed. Always prepared, always layered. Here's a little fringe fact to close on. Some Viking clothes were deliberately reversible, one side for daily use, the other for formal occasions. Because yes, even when the snow was blowing sideways and the fire smelled like boiled onions and despair, you still wanted to look halfway decent at a thing like a feast or a funeral. That kind of duality, function and pride, ran deep in Viking culture. You pull your cloak tighter now, grateful for the dense wool and the skill of whoever spun and stitched it. The fire crackles to life again. The longhouse stirs. It's going to be another brutal day outside. But inside, layer by layer, the warmth builds. Not just from the hearth, but from every sleeve, wrap, hood and boot in the room. Because here, in this world of wind and snow, you don't just wear warmth, you build it. It's mid-morning now, or at least you think it is. The sky outside is still grey, the light barely crawling through the thin window slits, and you wouldn't exactly call it bright in here. Still, the fire is going strong again, the air feels warmer, and people are finally upright, grumbling their way through another day of surviving winter with their limbs intact. You shift your weight on the raised platform and glance at the hearth, now busier than ever, someone stoking the coals, another person preparing a meal, and a child sitting dangerously close to the flames, hands outstretched like she owns the fire. You can't help but notice, the entire house is organised around the hearth, and everything revolves around keeping it both alive and contained. Which brings us to something the Vikings didn't just understand. They obsessed over how to keep their only source of heat from turning their carefully constructed home into a pile of glowing ash. Because when you're living inside a house built with turf, straw, dry wood and literally packed dirt, open flame is both your saviour and your biggest threat. So fireproofing, or the Viking version of it, became a serious, ever-present concern. Start with the obvious, the hearth itself. It's not just a random pit in the middle of the room, it's lined with flat stones and edged with larger heat-resistant rocks to keep flames contained and embers from rolling into someone's bedding. Over time, those stones get blackened and cracked, but they do the job. The fire doesn't wander, it stays put, low and central, like a well-trained dragon curled into a shallow nest. Above it there's the roof, a combustible nightmare of wooden beams and thatch, and yet the house hasn't burned down. Why? Because the Vikings engineered the smoke's escape carefully. Some longhouses featured a small adjustable vent at the roof's peak. Others relied on gaps in the rafters or cleverly placed openings that let smoke rise and drift out without letting wind and snow crash in. You couldn't eliminate the risk entirely, but you could manage it, and that's exactly what they did. Now you watch as someone sprinkles ashes around the edge of the hearth. At first it seems odd. Why add ash to ash? But then you realise they're creating a thermal buffer. The layer of cool, dead ash insulates the edges of the fire pit, keeps the heat from spreading, and helps smother sparks that try to jump ship. It's a fire break, a ring of safety, and this method, spreading ash as insulation, isn't just ancient guesswork. It works. It's been used for centuries, even into the modern era, by people who understood that sometimes the best fireproofing isn't fancy materials, it's just smart strategy. Here's where things get a little more creative. The Vikings also used mud and clay as fire barriers. Not everywhere, and not in every house, but where available, patches of clay were slapped onto walls or floors around the hearth to create non-flammable surfaces. Think of it as the prehistoric equivalent of a fire retardant mat. In some regions, clay was mixed into the actual construction of the hearth walls, making them more resistant to heat and damage over time. If it cracked, you patched it. If it dried out, you wet it down again. Simple maintenance, constant vigilance. And then there's the smoke. Always there. Always a reminder that you're living with fire, not above it. People paid attention to the way it moved. If it lingered too low, the fire needed adjustment. If it suddenly rushed upward, the wind outside had changed and someone might have to go check the roof vent. You didn't just light a fire and forget it. You watched it, listened to it, read its behaviour like a moody pet that might at any moment destroy everything you love. Of course, accidents still happened. Some were small, burned cloaks, scorched fur blankets, the occasional singed eyebrow. Others, catastrophic. Entire homes went up in flames, often during windstorms when a sudden gust could send sparks into dry thatch. There are sagas that begin with a fire, feuds ignited, revenge plotted, lives changed forever, and you can almost understand why. When fire fails, it doesn't fail quietly. But here's a strange little fringe fact. Some Viking communities developed fire codes. Well, okay, not codes in the legal sense, but customs and expectations about where fires could be built, how wood should be stored, and even how close neighbouring homes could be placed. In settlements where houses were clustered together, like those on trade routes or coastal villages, spacing mattered. If one home caught fire, it could take the whole street with it. So people left room between structures, cleared away flammable debris, and even shared water sources specifically for emergency dousing. Primitive? Yes, but also kind of brilliant. You glance toward a storage alcove in the far wall and notice a stack of buckets, wooden bound with iron bands sitting neatly in a row. Water, likely frozen, but still accessible. If the fire misbehaves, those buckets are your only defence. There's no fire department coming. Just you, your wits, and however fast you can throw cold water at a hot problem. Another layer of protection? The positioning of flammable goods, textiles, dried herbs, tools, all kept at a careful distance from the hearth. Above it, yes, you'll sometimes find food drying or meat smoking, but even that's suspended just far enough to avoid danger. If something falls in, it's a disaster. So ropes are checked, hooks are secured, and everyone knows not to hang anything heavy over open flame unless they're prepared to babysit it all night. And here's a final weird touch. Fire tongs. Almost every Viking home had a set of long iron tongs specifically for tending the hearth. Not because they were obsessed with grilling aesthetics, but because sticking your hands into a fire is a fast way to ruin your winter. These tongs were often passed down, repaired, and sharpened over time. In some families, they were as prized as a good axe or a fine cloak. Fire was life, and the tools that managed it, invaluable. You pull your own cloak tighter now, feeling the dry heat from the hearth rising again. Someone adds another log, carefully at the side, not directly in the flames. The fire flares, then settles. You breathe in the smoky warmth and realise you're not afraid of it anymore. Not really. Because everything around you, from the ash ring to the clay walls, from the roof vent to the water buckets, is designed to keep the danger in check. The Vikings didn't conquer fire. No one does. But they respected it, worked with it, and, when needed, fought like hell to keep it from turning their lifeline into their funeral pyre. And honestly, considering what their houses were made of, that's impressive. You're sitting by the hearth again, doing what you now realise is the full-time Viking winter job, not freezing to death. Someone's cooking something vaguely stew-like that's making the air thick with root vegetables and whatever protein was easiest to catch or barter this week. People are busying themselves quietly, mending clothes, stirring pots, checking the vent above the fire to make sure the smoke's still escaping and not curling back down into your lungs like yesterday. All pretty normal, that is, until you hear it. the unmistakable clop of hooves inside the house. You look up and blink. And sure enough, just beyond the main living area, separated by a low wooden partition and a curtain that is doing exactly nothing to block smell or sound, stands a goat. A real, live, hay-chewing goat. It locks eyes with you like it owns the place, then nonchalantly drops something unpleasant onto the floor. Welcome to the animal wing of the Viking winter shelter. It's not glamorous, it's not particularly clean, but it's warm. And in the dead of winter, sharing your home with livestock wasn't just tolerated, it was common sense. You might have thought it was just a poetic exaggeration in old folk tales. They lived in one room with their animals and so on, but it's painfully real. Because the same body heat principle that applies to your cousin snoring beside you under the sheepskin also applies to a living, breathing, steaming cow. These longhouses, especially in harsher regions like Iceland and Greenland, were often designed with integrated stalls or animal enclosures built right into the structure. Usually they were at the far end of the house, downhill if possible, so that any runoff, read animal waste, could be swept away or allowed to drain naturally. There'd be a half wall, maybe a low partition, maybe just a line of posts and some rope. No soundproofing, no separation of smells, just you, your family, and a whole bunch of four-legged heating systems. And yes, it was gross, but it was genius. A single cow gives off an enormous amount of heat, roughly equivalent to a 1,000-watt space heater, which is hilarious when you think about the fact that you're sitting here with a goat for company instead of shivering in an icebox. Pigs, sheep, goats, they all contribute. Even chickens added a little warmth to the room, especially if kept in a confined area or cage. Their body heat helped stabilize the temperature of the longhouse, acting as a kind of living insulation layer. You weren't so much living next to your animals as living with them, in the same breath, under the same roof. This setup wasn't just about heat either, it was also about safety. Your animals were your wealth, your dairy, your meat, your trade goods. Leaving them outside during a brutal storm was like tossing your gold into a snowbank and hoping it survived till spring. So inside they went. Yes, they pooped. Yes, they made noise. Yes, they occasionally tried to eat your boots. But you kept them close anyway, because losing a goat to frostbite was a bigger deal than losing a night of sleep to bleating. Now here's a strange little fringe fact. Some historians believe that in certain longhouses, the human sleeping area was deliberately elevated by a few inches, not just for comfort or status, but to be slightly above the animal stalls. Not only did this keep you away from the messiest part of the floor, but it also meant you were catching the best of the rising heat. Warm air goes up, after all, and the goat's breath. It's headed straight for your toes. And get this, some Viking texts and sagas mention homes being divided into three parts: the human living area, the animal stall, and a kind of transitional space that might have served as a storage zone or work area. This middle section acted like an airlock, trapping cold when people entered or exited, or when animals were brought in. It wasn't a hallway in the modern sense, more like a buffer zone, one more way to keep the cold out and the warmth and smells in. Of course, this cosy interspecies arrangement wasn't perfect. Disease could spread fast in tight quarters. Hay dust and animal dander mixed with soot and smoke created some seriously questionable air quality. And yeah, if a cow decided to throw a fit in the middle of the night, there was nothing between you and a face full of flying hooves but your reflexes and a badly secured rope. But the Vikings were nothing if not practical. They accepted discomfort if it increased their odds of survival. They cleaned what they could, moved animals out during the warmer months, and likely developed a tolerance for barnyard ambience that modern folks would find unthinkable. Honestly, after a few days of goat breath and cow farts, you start to forget there was ever another way to live. And here's a scholarly debate to chew on while you pretend that goat isn't eyeballing your bread. Did the presence of animals in the home influence domestic rituals and spiritual practices? Some experts argue that since livestock were so central to Viking survival, their presence inside the home, especially in winter, may have elevated their symbolic importance. There's archaeological evidence of small animal bones found in hearths, possibly from ritual offerings or seasonal feasts. Were these sacrifices, leftovers, just convenient disposal? No one knows for sure. But it's clear that the line between survival and spirituality was often blurred by the firelight. You shift your position again, now aware of the subtle but very real heat radiating from the animal stalls. It's not dramatic, not like sitting next to the hearth, but it's there, a low, steady warmth. a reminder that this building isn't just shelter, it's a system, a delicate, gross, brilliant ecosystem made of humans, animals, fire and dirt, all breathing together through the long dark. You glance over again, the goat is still there, chewing thoughtfully, judging you. You look away. You've lost that battle, so you pull your cloak around you, adjust your seat, and lean a little closer to the goat's corner, not because you like it, but because warmth is warmth, and winter doesn't care about your pride. And honestly, the goat's doing a better job than your cousin. At some point in the mid-afternoon, not that you can tell because the sun is still just a pale suggestion somewhere behind the snow-thick sky, you start to feel it, that gnawing, slow burn in your gut, the hollow ache that only gets worse when you breathe in and catch a whiff of something simmering on the hearth. Your stomach growls loud enough that the goat looks over, mildly offended. You're hungry. Again. And not just peckish. You're Viking hungry, winter hungry, the kind of hungry that laughs in the face of small portions and craves something so hearty it might as well be a blunt weapon. It's mealtime, and in a Viking winter, that doesn't just mean feeding your appetite, it means fueling your furnace. You don't eat for fun, you eat to survive. You shift over to where someone's ladling stew into rough hand-carved wooden bowls. It's thick, brown, and smells like onion, smoke, and mystery meat. Could be lamb, could be fish, could be the goat's cousin. No one's offering details, but your fingers are trembling with anticipation, not just from hunger, but from the sheer need to generate heat. Because in a Viking blizzard, food is fire. Everything you eat gets metabolized into warmth. Your body turns it into fuel, literally. Which is why Viking winter diets were off the charts in terms of fat, protein, and calories. Bread? Sure, if you're lucky and the flour stores haven't frozen into a medieval boulder. But what you really want is something rich, greasy, and capable of sticking to your ribs so long it could be used as insulation. The stew you're handed meets that requirement. It's oily, heavy, and just salty enough to convince you it was seasoned on purpose. There are chunks of meat, slices of turnip, and at least one root vegetable you've never seen before and hope to never see again. But it's hot. It's real food. And as it hits your stomach, you feel the slow, reassuring glow of internal combustion, like someone just lit a lantern inside your gut. Vikings didn't count calories. They didn't have to. Their entire lifestyle was a calorie math problem. You burn energy chopping firewood, replace it with fat, you haul water from a frozen stream, better eat some salted pork. You walk uphill through waist-high snow to check on the livestock. Time for butter, lots of it. And when butter wasn't available, they had something even more hardcore. Animal fat. Rendered, preserved, and used like a condiment/lifeline. Lumps of whale blubber in the far north, beef tallow in the inland farms, even seal fat on coastal settlements. Modern diet culture would have a stroke just reading their meal plan, but when it's 30 below and the wind sounds like a god's exhale, carbs and protein alone won't cut it. You need density, you need fuel bricks. Meat was usually preserved, dried, smoked, or salted. Fresh meat was rare in deep winter unless something died unexpectedly, or you slaughtered an animal on purpose, which means a lot of the meat you eat has that delightful, vaguely jerky texture of having lived its second life as rations. Fish, too, was often dried. Stockfish in particular, which is so tough it practically counts as construction material until rehydrated and boiled for hours. Now here's a fringe detail that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Viking winter diets included blood, blood pudding, blood sausages, and even blood broth. When you slaughtered an animal, you used every part, hooves, fat, organ meat, and yes, the blood. It was thickened with oats or flour, seasoned, if you were feeling fancy, and turned into a dense, iron-rich dish that was warm, filling, and perfect for the long dark. It might make you squeamish now, but at the time, it was practical magic. You take another bite of the stew and feel your jaw working harder than usual. The meat's tough. The root vegetables are undercooked in that stubborn way that makes you feel like you're chewing on resilience itself. But you don't care. It's food, and it's hot. You chase it down with a swig from a clay cup of something that might be ale, or might be very old water, and immediately regret not asking first. Some debate still simmers among historians about how much variety Viking winter diets really had. Some say it was boring and repetitive, barrels of salted herring, endless porridge, and whatever root vegetables hadn't turned to mush. Others point to archaeological finds of nuts, dried berries, imported grains, and even fermented milk products as evidence that things were more flavourful than we give them credit for. Either way, the focus was the same: don't starve, don't freeze, don't waste a single scrap. You look around the longhouse now and notice the rhythms of the meal. People eat fast but not frantic. Food is passed hand to hand. Nothing is left in the bowl. Every crust of bread is scraped up. Every drop of broth slurped clean. Even the goat, tied up and chewing contentedly, gets a handful of wilted greens or food scraps. Waste is not an option. Not when tomorrow's storm could last for days. Not when storage is finite and foraging isn't. And here's a charmingly grim little fact. Some food was stored under the floorboards. Not in jars, just in the cold earth, wrapped in cloth or tucked into sealed bags, packed with snow and frozen in place. A sort of prehistoric freezer. You could dig it out midwinter as needed, chisel it loose and hope it hadn't become the home of a hungry rodent. You weren't eating for taste, you were eating for February. After the meal, the bowls are wiped clean, not with water, but with rough cloths or even just pieces of bread. Dishes are stacked neatly, leftovers are bundled, not thrown out, and someone gets up and starts chopping fat chunks of dried lard into a pot for rendering. Later that'll become cooking oil, lamp fuel, or emergency food if things get really bleak. You settle back into your place, stomach full and body warm from the inside out. The fire is crackling again, and the air smells less like desperation, and more like, well, comfort. Sort of. You're still in a smoky, half-lit turf box with a goat, a dozen other people, and at least one stew ingredient you're trying not to think about. But you're full, and for now, that means you're safe. After the midday meal, there's a rare lull in activity. People are stretched out across the raised platforms, digesting like well-insulated cats. A few snore openly, others shift restlessly beneath thick woolen cloaks. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, and outside the wind sounds just a little more forgiving, as if the storm's exhausted itself and finally decided to take a nap. It's tempting to stay right here, warm and belly full, but then someone nudges you with the blunt end of a spear shaft. Not in a threatening way, more like an invitation. A cold, mildly insulting invitation. You're going out, you groan. Everyone does the first time, but the truth is, no matter how well built the longhouse, how tightly the turf is packed, or how many layers you're wearing, you can't stay cooped up all winter. Sometimes you have to move, check traps, haul firewood, reposition livestock, hunt, scout, maybe even travel to a neighbouring farmstead. And that's where things get even more interesting. Because the Vikings didn't only survive winter by building strong shelters, they also knew how to build portable ones. It's not like they were strapping yurts to their backs and hiking across snowfields. But the Norse were remarkably clever when it came to temporary shelters, emergency cover, and what you might call blizzard bivouacs. You follow your companion outside now, trudging through snowdrifts and past the main longhouse, where a few smaller structures huddle like siblings trying to stay out of the wind. These aren't permanent homes, they're outbuildings. Winter workshops, food stores, and sometimes emergency shelters. One of them is barely more than a lean-to. It's made from driftwood and bundled reeds, covered in snow and lashed together with rope and hide. You step inside and realise instantly what it's for: heat. Inside, it's snug, with a compact fire pit in the centre, small enough that a single person could heat it with a few coals. The walls are packed with snow from the outside, forming a kind of insulation cocoon. It's surprisingly effective. This kind of structure isn't unusual. When travelling across long distances in winter, or even just making extended forays out for wood or food, Vikings would build small snow shelters, or throw together makeshift huts called skarli, a general term for shelter or hut. Sometimes they use sleds and tents made from thick woolen canvas, or hide stretched over curved wooden poles. Think of it like a medieval camper van, minus the cup holders. Here's a strange, almost magical fringe fact. Snow, the very thing that's trying to kill you outside, actually becomes one of your greatest allies once you understand it. Snow shelters, dugout pits, snow caves, or hollowed drifts can trap heat incredibly well. Once inside, your own body warmth starts to raise the temperature. In fact, a properly constructed snow cave can keep you alive in sub-zero temperatures with little more than a candle for heat. The Vikings knew this, not in a scientific sense, but in a lived sense. You don't argue with the snow, you use it. In some sagas there are references to travellers being caught in surprise storms and building fjallbuda, temporary mountain huts, using whatever was at hand: stones, branches, sod, even parts of their sleds or boats. The construction didn't need to be pretty, it just had to hold. That's always the rule in winter. You don't build for comfort, you build for survival. If you can cook a little meat and keep your toes from turning black, you're doing great. As you look around the small outbuilding, you notice how little it takes to make it work. The walls are low, the roof slopes hard to one side, and there's barely any space to stand. It's cramped and smoky and already smells like damp leather. But if you were caught in a blizzard, this little box would be the difference between life and death. That kind of perspective changes what you value. You step back outside into the bitter air and scan the horizon. In the distance, past the tree line, there's the glint of something, another shelter. Maybe a cache of supplies hidden beneath snow and marked with a stick. That was common too, storing tools, wood or food at intervals across known travel routes. Think of it as a primitive supply chain. Every location had some kind of coverage: a lean-to, a dugout, a stash. It wasn't elaborate, it was just planned. There's even archaeological evidence that Vikings, especially in Greenland and Iceland, built small snow or turf-covered huts near travel routes during the darkest months, refuges for shepherds, hunters, or anyone caught out longer than expected. In the worst cases, these shelters weren't just helpful, they were the only thing standing between a living person and a frozen corpse. And here's a scholarly debate that's still wide open. Did the Vikings inherit their temporary shelter strategies from older, more nomadic cultures, or did they develop them independently out of sheer necessity? The Sami people, indigenous to the north, had highly mobile, tent-like dwellings long before the Vikings arrived in those latitudes. Some historians argue that Norse survival techniques were borrowed through contact. Others say the similarities are just parallel evolution, different peoples facing the same freezing enemy and coming to similar conclusions. Either way, the fact remains: if you were out in Viking territory in January, you'd better have known how to build a shelter, or you wouldn't be out there long. You follow your companion back toward the longhouse now, stomping snow from your boots as you pass a half-covered wood pile and duck into the main door. The sudden warmth and smell hit you like a blessing. Stew, fire, people snoring again, life, even if it's a little smoky. And here's something that hits you differently now. This place feels even more impressive after seeing the smaller shelters. The longhouse isn't just a home, it's headquarters, it's the winter base of operations. But it exists alongside a whole network of satellite shelters, tiny lifelines scattered across the frozen map, ready to save someone with the know-how to use them. You settle back into your usual spot, peel off your gloves and hold your hands over the fire. Your face still stings from the cold, but your core is already warming. Someone pours you a cup of something hot and mildly suspicious. You don't ask questions, you just sip. Because now you know, surviving the Viking winter didn't end at the doorstep. You had to be ready out there too, with the right clothes, the right tools, the right shelter, and the good sense to build a snow house before the storm decided to finish you off. By now you've figured out that surviving a Viking winter isn't just about brute strength or even clever building. It's about being ready. Always. Every day. Every moment. The storm doesn't give notice. The temperature doesn't warn you. Things go from manageable to miserable fast, and if your axe is dull or your bootstrap breaks at the wrong time, you're not getting a second chance. So when someone gestures toward the far end of the longhouse, toward a bench cluttered with tools, you know what's coming next. It's time to meet the real MVPs of the Viking blizzard season, the tools. You walk over and take a seat by the low bench. The tools aren't shiny. They're not beautifully carved or ornamented. They're used, handles worn smooth, blades darkened from age and exposure. You recognize a few: an axe, a knife, some sort of awl, but others are unfamiliar, shaped for tasks you've never had to do, like scraping ice from a sled runner or stitching a torn fur with bone needles thick as your thumb. This isn't a blacksmith shop or a warrior's armory. This is a winter survival toolkit. Let's start with the basics. The axe. It's not for show, it's for wood. Firewood doesn't chop itself, and in a world where the hearth is your life support machine, keeping the fuel coming is non-negotiable. But this isn't some massive two-handed berserker fantasy blade. It's a hand axe, maybe 2 feet long, with a slightly curved blade and a solid wooden haft. Compact, portable, made for splitting small logs and trimming branches, and sharpened religiously. A dull axe in a snowstorm is a death sentence. It wastes your energy, slows your progress, leaves you with half-cut wood that burns poorly and fills your house with smoke. Next to it is a knife. Long, narrow, versatile. Vikings carried these the way modern people carry phones, constantly and with deep emotional attachment. You used your knife for everything. Food prep, carving, cutting cords, shaping wood, defending yourself from wolves or angry goats. The one in front of you has a carved bone handle and a blade that looks like it's seen a few lifetimes. No frills, just function. That was the Viking way. Then there's the fire-starting gear, flint and steel. Nestled in a small leather pouch is a rounded stone and a curved piece of iron. If you know what you're doing, and let's be honest, you probably don't yet, you can strike the steel against the flint to create sparks and catch them on a bit of dry tinder. Inside the pouch is some of that too. Crumbled birch bark, dry moss, maybe even a few curls of fatwood. You'd better believe they protected this kit like treasure. Without fire, you're not just cold, you're dead. Now here's a quirky piece. A bone needle, curved slightly at the tip. You pick it up, surprised by how thick and heavy it feels compared to modern needles. This thing was made for sewing through hide, not cotton. Used with sinew or plant fibres, it could stitch together cloaks, boots, shelter coverings, whatever needed repair. No part of winter survival relied on staying pristine. Everything broke eventually. The trick was being able to fix it fast. And that brings us to the most underrated tool of all: cordage. Twine, rope, strips of leather. Any of these could be twisted, braided, or knotted to hold things together, repair gear, secure sleds, or tie up anything from firewood bundles to stubborn livestock. Vikings made rope from animal sinew, hair, bark fibres, and even seaweed, depending on the region. If it could hold tension, it had value. There's an entire quiet genius to Viking knots. Fast, strong, and designed to work even when your hands are numb and the wind's howling. Here's something modern minds might miss. Every tool had to travel. This wasn't a world of garage workbenches and shed drawers. Tools were worn, strapped to belts, tied into satchels. If you left home without your essentials, you might not come back. So most Vikings had a toolkit on them at all times. Smaller than what you see here, sure, but containing the same core items: knife, flint, cordage, awl. The holy trinity of don't die outside. A fringe detail that fascinates archaeologists: the variety of personalised toolkits. Some included miniature hammers, tiny chisels or fishhooks. Others had whetstones tied with leather thongs and carved with runes. Maybe for luck, maybe for ownership, maybe because when you've sharpened your axe 500 times you want it to feel like yours. These kits were sometimes buried with their owners, because if you needed your tools in this life, who's to say you wouldn't need them in the next? You glance down at the pile of tools again, realizing how much effort went into their upkeep. Every blade sharpened, every rope coiled, every pouch sealed with care. Vikings didn't have the luxury of letting things rust or break or vanish under a snowdrift. A missing knife wasn't an inconvenience, it was a critical failure. You didn't survive by having the most stuff, you survived by taking care of what you had relentlessly. Now comes the debate part. Some scholars argue that tool specialization increased over time, with more refined gear appearing in later periods as trade routes expanded and metalworking improved. Others believe the core toolkit remained mostly unchanged throughout the Viking Age: simple, rugged, versatile. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some regions had access to better materials and smiths, sure. But in the deep winter, far from the ports, it didn't matter whether your knife was fancy, it just needed to cut. Someone picks up the axe now, checking the edge with a practiced eye. They run a whetstone over it a few times, testing, listening for that telltale scrape that says, almost. You watch, absorbing the rhythm. Not rushed, not bored, just aware. Tools aren't magic, but when you're standing in snow up to your thighs and the wind is screaming, they might as well be. You pick up the fire kit and feel its weight. It's not heavy, but it might be the most important thing in the entire room. Because out here, in this frozen place, the right tool doesn't just make your life easier, it makes it possible. The wind shifts again just after dusk, sharper now, biting through the seams of the longhouse like a knife poking between ribs. The smoke vent has to be adjusted again. Someone climbs up toward the rafters to fix it, muttering under their breath as they nudge the flap open with a wooden rod. A rush of smoke escapes, curling upward into the night like a silent offering. You pull your cloak tighter, the fire crackling louder now as fresh logs are added. And then, somewhere near the door, someone mutters a prayer. It's not loud, it's not formal. No chanting or dramatic gestures, just a quiet line of Old Norse, directed toward no one and everyone at once. You catch the word Thor and something about storms, and realise the Vikings weren't just preparing for blizzards with turf and tools, they were preparing spiritually. Because out here, when the storm howled like a creature and the cold sank into your bones like a curse, you didn't just need warmth, you needed protection. That's right. Tonight we're diving into the other kind of insulation, spiritual insulation. Because surviving a Viking winter wasn't just about physics, it was also about faith, magic, superstition, and the deep lingering sense that the elements weren't just natural forces, they were alive. You've already heard the gods' names whispered here and there. Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, Freya for good harvests and peace. But in the middle of winter, it wasn't the big feasts or heroic tales that mattered most. It was the quiet rituals, the whispered words, the runes carved into door frames, the charms hung from beams, the protective amulets tied into children's clothing, the sense that maybe, just maybe, someone, or something, was watching over you. You glance up now and notice one of those charms, a small disc of bone carved with runes, dangling from a leather cord above the doorway. It sways slightly in the draught, casting a flickering shadow on the turf wall. It's simple, unadorned, and unmistakably intentional. These kinds of talismans, called Verdandi, Galdur, or simply protection runes, were everywhere in Viking homes. Some were burned into wood, others etched into knives, combs, or even loom weights. Their meanings varied: strength, endurance, fire, safety, luck. But the purpose was always the same: keep death out. One of the older women sitting by the fire reaches into her pouch and pulls out a small object, a folded piece of leather wrapped in twine. She unties it slowly, revealing a bundle of herbs, a tiny shard of iron, and a knotted thread. A cedar charm. You've heard whispers of these. Magic not from the gods exactly, but from the hidden forces of the world. Women, especially older ones, were often seen as keepers of this knowledge. Not witches exactly, not saints, just intermediaries. And in winter, people listen to them more than usual. There's a long-running scholarly debate about how widespread magical practices really were among average Viking families. Some argue it was all mythology, stories passed down, not actual practice. But archaeological finds suggest otherwise. Burial sites containing amulets, herbs, carved runes, and ritual objects. Bones arranged in deliberate patterns. Traces of red ochre smeared on house walls. Whether it was organised religion, folk belief, or something in between, one thing is clear. The Vikings turned to more than just logs and turf when the cold pressed in. Here's a fringe detail to chill your spine a little. Some longhouses buried protective charms under the threshold. That's right. Before building, they might slip a bone, a stone, or a carved figure beneath the entrance, hoping it would ward off evil, or at least bad luck. The doorway was a liminal space, a boundary between the wild and the safe. If anything tried to get in, spirits, bad weather, ill intent, that charm was your first line of defence. And then there were the house spirits. Vetir, they were called. Land spirits, ancestors, guardians of hearth and home. You didn't see them, but you felt them. Some lived near the fire, others in the walls. Some families believed a particular animal, like a fox or a raven, was a messenger of these spirits. If one crossed your path, you paid attention. If it showed up near your house, you left out an offering, a crust of bread, a cup of ale, a whispered thank you. Because even if the gods were busy, maybe the spirits were listening. You turn back toward the hearth and notice a small bundle tucked just beside the stone ring. It's been there all day, but you hadn't really seen it until now. Dried herbs, maybe mugwort or juniper, tied with red thread. A fire blessing, most likely, meant to keep the flames burning steady and the smoke from turning hostile. Because yes, even the fire could be temperamental, not just physically, but spiritually. If it smoked too much, if it hissed, if it blew sparks, someone might whisper an apology, or offer a pinch of salt, just in case. The most respected homes, those with elders, or someone gifted in the old ways, sometimes had dedicated blessing days. Rituals to cleanse the house, drive out illness, call in fortune. These weren't loud affairs, no big ceremonies, just quiet routines performed when needed. A sweep with a special broom, a cup of melted snow poured at the threshold, words spoken under the breath, all designed to keep the thin veil between survival and disaster from tearing. And the winters were long, long enough that these rituals became anchors, little things to cling to when the wind didn't stop and the sun barely showed up, and the food started to look smaller and smaller. Faith, magic, belief. It gave shape to the darkness. It made it personal. Gave you someone to argue with when the cold was unbearable. Gave you hope, which is arguably the warmest thing you can have. You sit now, watching the fire and the people, and realize something else. These rituals weren't just about protection. They were about control. In a world where snow buried your roof and wolves stalked the tree line, doing something, even if it was just hanging a charm or mumbling to a spirit, meant you weren't entirely powerless. And isn't that the core of it? You build a house, you stack turf, you light fires, you huddle with goats and grumpy relatives, but you also carry hope in your pocket. You trace runes into the wooden bedposts. You whisper to the fire and offer a crust of bread to something you'll never see. Not because it guarantees survival, but because it gives you the courage to try. The snow started falling again just after midnight, soft at first, harmless little flakes drifting down through the roof vent, catching in your hair like someone shaking powdered sugar from the rafters. It seemed peaceful, almost poetic. But now the house groans. It's not loud, it's subtle. A low, aching creak from above, followed by a muffled thump, and then another. You lie still, all your senses suddenly on high alert. The walls feel like they're holding their breath. Someone else has sat up too, a shadow by the hearth, blinking sleep from their eyes, listening. Then it happens. A sharper sound. A shearing crack from above as a roof beam shifts under pressure. Everyone's awake now. This is the moment the whole structure has trained for. And this is where we answer a cold, blunt question. What happens when it doesn't hold? Because no matter how brilliant the design, no matter how clever the turf layering, every Viking home walked a fine line during winter. And sometimes, that line snapped under the weight of snow. You pull on your cloak as people scramble, quietly but quickly. No screaming, no panic, just practiced motion. 2 men near the door grab their cloaks and duck outside into the dark, leaving the door flapping like a loose jaw. Inside, the rest of you wait. No one speaks. It's not superstition, it's calculation. Because once the roof starts creaking like that, you've only got 2 options. Clear the snow, or get out. The longhouse roof is heavy by design, built to hold turf, thatch, snow, everything, but it wasn't invincible. An unexpected thaw followed by a sudden freeze? Disaster. A week's worth of wet snow instead of light powder? That'll crush a support beam faster than a bad decision. Vikings understood this. That's why maintenance wasn't optional. It was constant. Roofs were cleared regularly even in storms. Someone, usually the younger, sprier members of the household, climbed up and shoveled off the weight, balancing on slick turf in brutal wind, because not doing so meant waking up with your house caving in around you. Out there now, in the dark, the snow is being pushed off with big, awkward shovels made from bent wood and rawhide. You can hear it sliding off in heavy chunks. The longhouse shakes slightly, like it's exhaling. Still, the fear doesn't go away, because once a roof starts failing, you don't always get a second chance. Here's the thing. Collapse wasn't just theoretical. It happened, often enough to be remembered. Some Viking sagas even open with the story of a roof caving in, killing livestock, trapping children, or wiping out entire sleeping quarters. These weren't dramatic exaggerations. They were warnings. Weather didn't respect your craftsmanship. Snow didn't care about your plans. You glance upward at the rafters above you. They're thick, hewn from driftwood and pine, darkened with smoke and time. Between them, the layers of turf and straw sit heavy, now probably weighed down with an extra foot of snow. You try not to imagine the whole thing giving way, but everyone in the room knows it's possible. That's the reality of winter up here. You're never entirely safe. You just lower the odds. Here's a strange, slightly morbid fringe fact. Some longhouses had interior support beams added after initial construction, driven into the centre of the room like a spinal column. Not for aesthetics, not for design, just as emergency insurance, a backup spine to keep the roof from dropping directly onto everyone's heads. These weren't always pretty. sometimes just a big tree trunk wedged awkwardly between the floor and the rafters. But in a snow-heavy winter, that post was the difference between sleeping through the night and being crushed mid-dream. And the floor, it matters too. If the ground beneath your home was unstable, prone to thaw, softening under moisture, it could shift. A slight tilt in the foundation could send the load of the roof off balance. Suddenly one corner collapses, then another, and the whole house lists like a sinking ship. So Vikings didn't just shovel snow, they inspected walls, patched turf, reinforced corners. Survival was proactive. There was no wait and see. There's still academic debate about just how common these structural failures were. Some argue they were rare, exaggerated in saga lore for drama. Others point to settlement sites buried under collapsed turf and charred beams as evidence that winter was not kind to poorly maintained homes. Archaeological layers sometimes show signs of a house being rebuilt multiple times in the same spot, suggesting collapses, fire, or both. Now you feel the floor vibrate slightly. The door opens. The two men return, cloaks heavy with snow, faces flushed with cold and relief. One of them gives a nod. The roof is safe. For now. A few people murmur thanks, not just to each other, but to the spirits, the house itself, maybe even the snow for showing mercy. You don't know. You just breathe out slowly. Your muscles unclench. And then, because you have no other option, you lay back down. This is the Viking reality. You don't wait for disaster. You assume it's coming, and you plan accordingly. You reinforce your roof with a third layer of turf. You check your support beams weekly. You keep shovels by the door, not just for digging out, but for up. You teach your kids which beam to stand under if they hear a certain kind of creak, and you never ever say the words safe or done out loud, because the snow is listening. You pull your blanket tighter, watching the way the shadows dance across the rafters. The longhouse feels heavier now, not just structurally but emotionally. You've passed through a kind of winter rite, one of those moments when nature reminds you, politely but firmly, that it's still in charge. And as sleep pulls you back under, slow and reluctant, you think about those beams. You hope they're strong. The next morning the longhouse is quieter than usual. Not silent exactly. There's still the crackle of the fire, the creaking of beams, the occasional grunt from someone trying to sit up without pulling a muscle. But it's a heavy kind of quiet. Yesterday's roof scare left its mark. Everyone's moving slower, more deliberate. You can feel it in the air, like the whole household has tightened its grip on survival. You pull your cloak around your shoulders, still warm from body heat and smoke, and scan the room. No one's joking this morning, not yet. But then, from somewhere in the corner you hear it. Knocking. Not knocking on the door. Knocking on the wall, not hard, not angry. Just 3 solid taps, followed by a muffled voice calling something you can't quite make out through the thick turf and stone. And then, in a rush of movement, the door's unlatched and pushed open, letting in a gust of freezing wind and 2 bundled figures from the outside world. Neighbours, well, technically cousins. But in a Viking settlement, the line between neighbour and relative is blurry at best. What matters more is this: you're not alone. It's easy to forget that. When you're hunkered down for weeks snowed in, seeing only the same soot-smeared faces day after day, it starts to feel like your longhouse is the entire world. But out here in the blizzard-blasted countryside, community wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. You could build the strongest shelter in the world, stack turf 10 layers thick, stockpile enough firewood to toast a god. But if your neighbour's house burned down or their roof collapsed, you were on the hook. That's how Viking society worked in winter. Mutual survival. Neighbourly warmth, whether you liked them or not. The 2 visitors stomped snow from their boots, already halfway through the ritual of shedding cloaks, shaking off frost, warming hands over the hearth. One hand's over a small bundle wrapped in fur, some kind of dried meat or maybe aged cheese, a gift, a gesture. You offer ale in return, ladled from a lukewarm barrel that's probably older than the youngest child in the house. No one thanks anyone out loud. That's not how this works. The thanks is in the sharing. This wasn't just about social visits. Viking longhouses were hubs in a much larger network, each one connected to others across the valley, over the ridge, along the fjord. Families intermarried, traded, shared resources, and sometimes, yes, fought like animals over inheritance or goats. But when the snow came, so did the truce. You didn't feud when someone might be pulling your kid out of a collapsed barn next week, and the truth is, no longhouse was self-sufficient. Not really. Some had more wood, others had better grazing. One might have a skilled weaver, another a hunter worth listening to. Everyone had gaps. Everyone needed help sometimes. So if your neighbour's thatched roof blew off in a storm, you grabbed your shovel and your patience and helped patch it. Not because you were generous, because you might be next. There's a deeply practical rhythm to all this. You visit each other during breaks in the weather, drop off supplies, share news, ask for help repairing sled runners or retrieving a trapped sheep. Sometimes you just sit and trade stories around a different fire, get a break from the snores you've been listening to since October, laugh with someone who doesn't grind their teeth in their sleep. And here's a quirky fringe detail. Some Viking settlements had designated meeting houses or communal shelters for moments like these. Simple structures, sometimes no bigger than a large shed, stocked with emergency supplies, grain, dried fish, spare cloaks. They were shared spaces, maintained by the surrounding families, and they operated on the oldest economy in the world. You take what you need, and you better give back when you can. These were rarely used, but when they were, they saved lives. You glance back at the two visitors now, warmed up and halfway through a bowl of yesterday's stew. One of them is sharing a rumour about a neighbouring farm losing a wool during the last storm. Another's talking about how their goat gave birth early. A good sign, maybe. Everyone leans in slightly, because news is more than gossip. It's orientation. It tells you how big your world is, how well everyone else is surviving, and what you might face next. The idea of isolation in Viking winter is romantic in hindsight. Epic sagas told around the hearth, stoic warriors battling frost. But the reality, it was dangerous. Too much isolation could drive people to desperation, or madness. So you kept your doors open, at least metaphorically. And when the weather allowed, you went. Even if it meant snow to your knees, even if you were just delivering news that, yes, your roof is still standing and no one's frozen solid yet. Some historians argue this instinct for inter-household support is what kept remote Viking communities alive. The ones that collapsed, they say, didn't fail because of weather or enemies. They failed because of disconnection. People hoarded instead of sharing, closed their doors instead of opening them, and when the blizzard came or the stores ran out, no one came knocking, others pushed back. They argue that such idealized communal harmony ignores the social tensions always simmering just under the surface. Rivalries, grudges, power struggles. But even those scholars admit that, in the coldest months, cooperation often won out over conflict. Winter was the great equalizer. It didn't care who owned more land or who insulted whom at last summer's feast. Everyone froze the same. You refill the visitors' cups, listening now to a story about a man who tried to travel during a whiteout and ended up trapped in a snow cave for 2 days, surviving on smoked fish and prayers to Freya. You all laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's familiar. You've been close to that edge yourself. Everyone has. Soon the visitors stand, cloaks back on, boots strapped. They're heading back before the light fails completely. What little light there is this time of year. At the door, one of them pats the side beam twice before stepping out. Not superstition, not exactly, just tradition. A promise to return, a nod to the house itself. You've started doing it too. And when the door shuts behind them, and the wind howls through the crack before the latch clicks, you feel it. The house feels warmer, not because the fire got hotter, because you are reminded that you're not alone. Evening settles in with the kind of silence that only snow can create. The world outside muffled and soft, like the sky dropped a blanket over everything and told it to hush. Inside the longhouse, though, it's anything but quiet. People are moving, speaking in low tones, arranging benches and sweeping the floor with birch twig brooms. Someone throws more wood on the fire, and the flames leap up in welcome, casting long, flickering shadows across the turf walls. Something's happening. There's an energy in the air, more than just surviving the cold. Tonight is gathering night. It's not a feast, exactly. That implies excess, and in the middle of winter, excess is about as common as sunburn. But that doesn't mean the Vikings sat in silence every night, grimly chewing on dried fish and brooding. No, every so often they made room for joy, for music, for stories, for something resembling celebration. Because if you're going to be stuck indoors for 5 months with the same dozen people, you'd better figure out how to enjoy each other's company, or you'll end up using that fire pit for more than cooking. You help clear a space near the hearth as someone brings out a small drum, animal hide stretched over a wooden frame, beaten with fingers and palms in a rhythm that feels more like a heartbeat than a tune. It's not loud, not yet. But it starts pulling people into a shared tempo. Children stop bickering. Elders sit up straighter. Someone hums, soft and low, in a melody older than anyone in the room. And then the stories begin. Not just any stories either. These are blizzard stories. The kind passed down through generations, told and retold every winter. Tales of frost giants wandering the mountains, of men who challenged the wind and lost their names, of mysterious lights dancing in the sky, drawing travellers off the safe path. You've heard some of them before, half-truths wrapped in wonder, but tonight they sound different, more urgent, more real. You lean in as an elder begins her tale. Her voice is low, gravelly, like a log slowly catching fire. She speaks of a man who built a house so strong, so perfect, it kept out every storm, until the spirits of winter, offended by his pride, sent a blizzard so fierce it buried the house completely. His family survived, she says, but only because he remembered to leave offerings at the door, every new moon, just in case the land spirits were listening. There's a beat of silence afterward, like the house itself is considering the tale. Then someone chuckles, someone else claps, and just like that the tension breaks. That's the thing about these evenings. They're not just about entertainment, they're medicine. In a season that wants to drain you, flatten your spirit and freeze your will to the floor, joy becomes an act of resistance. Laughter is armour, music is heat, stories are the glue that keeps minds from unravelling. One of the younger men stands and starts mimicking the elder's voice, telling a ridiculous version of the tale where the house survives, because it's insulated with goat hair and sealed with fish oil. Everyone laughs, even the elder, who shakes her head but says nothing. This is how you keep going. This is how you keep each other warm. Now here's a quirky historical footnote. Some Viking longhouses had dedicated high seats near the hearth, reserved for storytelling or guests of honour. Not thrones, just raised platforms or decorated benches, but their presence alone tells you how seriously these gatherings were taken. The stories weren't random chatter. They were part of the household rhythm, the oral library, the family lore, part entertainment, part education, part subtle social training. And music. It wasn't flashy. No orchestras here. Just the drum, a flute carved from bone, maybe a small harp or lyre if someone in the family was skilled, and if the strings hadn't snapped from the dry winter air. Voices did most of the work, singing in rounds, chants, songs with call and response patterns that let even the children join in. No one worried about pitch. The goal wasn't perfection. The goal was connection. There's even debate among scholars about just how organised these winter performances were. Some argue that Viking storytelling followed a strict tradition, with designated keepers of law, skalds, responsible for preserving the sagas. Others believe it was more communal, more spontaneous, a blend of myth, memory, and a good sense of timing. Either way it mattered, because in the dead of winter, what else do you have but each other and the tales you carry? You shift in your seat now, legs stretched toward the fire, listening as the music grows bolder. The drum beat speeds up. Someone taps 2 wooden spoons together. A girl sings a verse about a reindeer with golden antlers who outwitted a hunter by leading him in circles until he fell asleep standing up. You don't know if it's an old myth or something she just made up, but no one questions it. The line between legend and improv is pleasantly blurry here. And then comes the dancing, not the kind you're used to, no twirls or elegance, just stomping, clapping, swaying in place. Movement to warm the blood, keep the limbs loose, remind the body that it's not just a heat sponge lying on a platform. You join in, awkwardly at first, but then you find the rhythm, and the rhythm finds you. Here's something else worth noting. These communal winter gatherings were a chance to check in, not just socially, but emotionally. If someone wasn't laughing, wasn't singing, if they always sat at the edge of the firelight, people noticed. Not because they were nosy, but because isolation kills. Melancholy too. And the Vikings, as hardened as they were, understood the importance of watching out for one another's spirit as much as their shelter. The night rolls on. Slowly the music fades. The last story is told, a funny one with a ghost, a pig, and a pair of stolen boots. People start peeling away, one by one, returning to their spots along the platform, or settling near the embers to watch the last of the flames die down. The air is warm, thick with breath and soot and something else. Contentment, maybe. You lie back and stare at the ceiling. The beams above seem less like supports now and more like old friends, cradling the weight of the world so you can sleep with a little less fear. The storm outside is still whispering, but inside it feels like the house is glowing from within. Because sometimes, in the middle of the hardest season, you don't survive by being stronger or faster. You survive by gathering close, singing loud, and refusing to be cold together. The morning after a gathering night always feels a little slower, like the house itself is nursing a hangover. The fire's down to coals, the air heavy with last night's smoke, and no one's in a hurry to be the first one up. You're lying beneath your cloak, wrapped in that half-sleep where dreams and memories blur when someone nudges your foot, not roughly, not urgently, but with purpose. You sit up, rubbing your eyes, and the first thing you see is steel. Not just any steel, a sword, being sharpened. You blink again. Welcome back to Viking reality. Because even in winter, even during blizzards, snowdrifts, and goat cuddles by the hearth, there's still one element of life that refuses to freeze: conflict. The man honing his blade isn't doing it for ceremony. He's checking the edge like a butcher, testing its bite against the light. Nearby, another is oiling his spearhead, the tip resting against his knee like he's chatting with it. There's tension in the room today, not just the usual cabin fever grumbling or petty cloak-stealing drama. Something's off. And then someone speaks the words that make everyone go quiet. They're coming. No need to ask who they are. You already know. The neighbours, the rivals, the ones who own the western path to the river, and have always claimed the rights to that lowland forest, where the hunting is better and the wood grows straighter. The people you shared mead with 2 summers ago, and nearly came to blows with last fall. And now they've been spotted near your border, in the middle of winter. Which brings us to a very important truth that might be hard to digest after last night's adorable goat songs and rune charms. Vikings did not stop fighting just because it snowed. Sure, war in winter was harder. Cold made armour brittle, travel treacherous, wounds deadlier. But if desperation called, or opportunity knocked, men went to war anyway, snow or not. In fact, winter skirmishes weren't uncommon at all. Settlements were vulnerable, supplies were scarce, and sometimes the best way to survive wasn't building a better fire, or it was taking someone else's. You rise slowly, watching as the longhouse subtly shifts from home to fortress. The women begin to move with sharper purpose, packing food, tying bundles of clothing, warming water to pour into skin pouches. A boy who can't be more than 10 is checking the bindings on a bow. No one tells him to stop. This is how you grow up here. Winter doesn't shield you from danger. It just changes what that danger looks like. Someone opens the back hatch, a narrow exit few people ever use. It leads to the animal stalls and beyond that to a narrow ravine that could be used to escape, or to flank anyone coming too close. You realise as people begin to move that you're part of a strategy. This house isn't just shelter, it's defence. The thick turf walls, the small windows, the low roof, they're all part of a system designed not only to keep cold out, but to slow down enemies. Here's a fringe detail that doesn't make it into most Viking dramas. Longhouses were often fortified, not with moats or towers, but with clever little adjustments, hidden compartments, heavy beams that could drop across doors, wall niches for hiding weapons. The doorways were intentionally narrow and low, forcing anyone entering to duck their head and expose their back. That's not an accident. That's a welcome mat with murder in mind. Scholars still argue over how often actual combat happened in winter. Some say it was rare, travel too risky, battles too costly. But others point to sagas and regional conflicts where winter raids were common, especially over food and land. One fight might not involve hundreds of men, but a dozen. That's more than enough to burn a barn, steal livestock, or break your roof beams. You're handed a spear. It's heavy, iron-tipped, the shaft worn smooth from years of use. Not ceremonial, not decorative. It smells faintly of oil and old sweat. You don't know if you're meant to guard the door or just hold it in case things go bad, but either way it's real now. This is how things went sometimes. Feuds didn't respect the season. Old grudges boiled over when people were stuck inside too long, or when a herd wandered over someone's invisible property line, or when a hungry mouth made someone a little too bold. And winter warfare had its own flavour. Sneak attacks under snow cover, tracking enemies by their footprints. using frozen lakes as shortcuts, or traps. Fire became a weapon. One torch, thrown onto a thatch roof buried in dry frost, could destroy an entire family's shelter. And just like that, survival became someone else's problem. But as you stand there, pulse ticking in your ears, you realise something else. It's not always about bloodshed. Sometimes just showing up, armed and ready, is enough. Posturing, positioning, making it clear that if someone comes through your door uninvited, they won't leave with all their limbs. That kind of presence matters. It keeps peace without pretending peace is the default. Your group doesn't rush out into the storm. No one charges into the snow yelling war cries. Instead, 3 men quietly take their places outside the house, cloaked, still as trees, watching, waiting. You're told to stay inside, hold your position. If it comes to fighting, you'll know soon enough. The day passes slowly. Tension curls around the hearth like smoke. Meals are eaten with one eye on the door. Tools are tucked away. Weapons are within reach. Outside, the storm grows heavier. Maybe enough to delay any plans of attack. Maybe enough to send would-be raiders home empty-handed. By nightfall, word comes, they didn't come closer. No one cheers, no one relaxes too much. But the fire feels warmer. The fear eases its grip. And here's the quiet truth about Viking winters that no saga ever quite captures. Sometimes survival means swinging a sword. But most of the time, it means knowing when not to swing it. You hang the spear back on its hook, tuck in beside the hearth again, and breathe deep. Not safe, not peaceful, but for tonight, still standing. The next day brings a strange calm, the kind that follows a threat that didn't fully bloom. No one says it out loud, but everyone's thinking the same thing. We're lucky. Maybe the weather turned worse and kept the would-be raiders at bay. Maybe your show of readiness was enough. Maybe they were never coming in the first place. Doesn't matter. You were ready, and you still are. But something about the tension hanging in the air makes you notice the longship more than usual. Not because it's moving, it's not, but because now you're starting to think about what else the Vikings did with their winter besides huddle and fight. You step outside after breakfast, trudging through thick snow to where the old ship rests under its crude wooden canopy. It's partially buried, wrapped in a tattered wool tarp and crusted with frost. But beneath all that, it still looks powerful, still looks like freedom. Not the kind of freedom that takes you somewhere warm, because that doesn't exist right now, but the kind that lets you move, and in Viking territory, that meant everything. Yes, this is the part where we talk about something deeply unexpected. How Vikings could turn ships into shelters. At first, it sounds ridiculous. What are you going to do, sail through a frozen fjord into a blizzard? Build a fire on the deck and hope the wind doesn't snap your ears off? But no, this wasn't about sailing. This was about repurposing. You walk around the hull now, seeing the ship not as a machine of war or trade, but as a building. And suddenly the shape makes sense. It's already curved like a roof. It's long and narrow like a hall. And if flipped or covered properly, it could provide shelter when nothing else was available. Out on expeditions, or worse, if you were stranded during one, your ship was your backup plan. Flip it over, lean it on its side, build turf or snow walls around the exposed parts, throw some hides or sailcloth over the top and boom, instant hut. Not pretty, not warm, but better than dying frozen and alone on the coast. You could even use the mast as a centre pole to support a tent-like structure, with ropes anchoring the sides to stakes in the ground, or if you were inland, to trees. There's archaeological evidence of boat shelters across Viking territory, especially in more remote outposts. Greenland, Iceland, even Scotland and the Faroes. Excavations have turned up the remains of ships embedded in earthworks, their hulls acting as the core structure of turf-walled shelters. Some even had hearths built inside, suggesting they weren't just emergency tents. They were lived in for entire seasons. Whether you were stuck by weather, hunting in the deep wilderness, or scouting new land, that ship was your portable longhouse. And here's your fringe fact for the day. In parts of Norway, some Viking graves show evidence of people being buried in boats that had been used as homes. That's right. The same ship that carried you through fjords, fought in battles, and maybe kept you alive through a brutal winter ended up being your final resting place. Vikings didn't just value ships as tools, they saw them as companions, shelter, protection, even spiritual vessels. Of course, ship shelters weren't luxurious. Inside, you'd sleep curled against the hull, huddled with others, hoping your fire pit didn't smoke you out or that the mast didn't crack under snowfall. but you'd survive. And in a culture where most people didn't expect comfort from life, or death, that was enough. Some historians debate just how common these shelters were. Was this a widespread tactic, or something used only by explorers and outliers? The consensus leans toward the latter, but with a caveat. Even if rare, the knowledge was there, the skills, the mindset. A Viking saw a ship not just as transportation, but as material. Wood was scarce in many regions, and ships were prime resources. A broken ship wasn't thrown away, it was salvaged, turned into walls, beams, firewood, or winter refuge. Nothing wasted. Ever. Back at the longhouse, you mentioned the idea of turning a boat into shelter, and one of the elders nods like it's the most obvious thing in the world. If it floats, it can hold snow, he mutters, which sounds ridiculous and wise at the same time. He then proceeds to tell you a story about a man who once lived under his overturned boat for an entire winter after getting separated from his hunting party, survived on frozen berries, dried fish, and luck. Found in the spring, half-starved and fully bearded, claiming to have spoken with a sea spirit during the worst storm of the season. Everyone laughs. No one doubts it. This is what being Viking meant. Not just sailing far or fighting hard, but adapting fast. Turning danger into a new design. Using the only thing you had, whatever was in your hands, to beat back the cold and keep breathing one more night. You step away from the ship, eyes scanning the ridge where yesterday's threat had loomed. It's empty now, but your awareness hasn't faded. Because even as the snow piles up and the dark settles in, you know this truth deeper than before. Sometimes survival comes from a longhouse, sometimes from a prayer, and sometimes it comes from the ribs of a ship you haven't needed yet, but might, any day now. So you check the rope, you brush snow off the hull, you whisper thanks to the ship, just in case, and you go back inside where the fire's still burning. The blizzard hits again on the fourth night after the false alarm, harder this time. Not the creeping kind that slowly smothers everything under a polite layer of snow, but a full-force siege of wind and ice. The kind of storm that makes the roof whimper and the door swell in its frame. It starts with a low moan just after sundown, builds through the hours like an angry god pacing outside, and by midnight, you've all given up on sleeping. No one says it out loud, but the tension is thick. This one could test the limits. The longhouse has weathered worse, or so you're told, but that's not exactly reassuring when the walls are vibrating, and you swear the floor just shifted under your feet. You're wrapped in everything you own. Fur cloak, woolen underlayers, an itchy blanket that might have once been a rug. Still, you're shivering, and it's not just from the cold. Here's where we talk about something that doesn't often get much glory in Viking lore. What happens when things go wrong? Because for all the pride in engineering and spiritual rituals, for all the stories of resilience and goat-warmed coziness, there were times when it wasn't enough. And this feels like one of those times. Someone's shouting now, one of the elders near the far wall. The turf there is bowing slightly, snow pressing against it like a drunk trying to barge through a locked door. A crack appears near the top, just a thin line, but it's the kind of line that makes the entire house hold its breath. You rush over with others, grabbing spare beams, planks and whatever can be jammed into place to hold the wall upright. Someone mutters a curse, someone else mutters a prayer, and just like that your home becomes a battlefield again, not against raiders, but against the land itself. There's no heroic music, just the grunt of effort, the hiss of snow sneaking in through the seams, and the sound of a roof beam groaning under a new load of wind-packed frost. You work fast, because there's no other option. This isn't about carpentry, it's triage. Viking longhouses were built to flex under pressure, literally. The turf walls could shift slightly without cracking, and the wooden frame had a degree of give built in. That's why you didn't nail everything together, you wedged and fitted it. A rigid structure would splinter under the first real storm, a flexible one. It bent and bounced back, but there was always a threshold. A point when snow got too heavy, or the ground softened too much, or the materials aged out of their usefulness. And when that happened, all the fire and fur in the world wouldn't help you. You had to respond, improvise, reinforce, adapt. Here's a fringe survival trick passed down in whispers. Snow can be your enemy, but it can also be your patch. You pack it tightly into the breeches, just the right kind, dense and slightly wet, and it freezes into a barrier harder than clay. It's not a long-term fix, but it'll hold through the night. Maybe, if the wind doesn't shift. You do that now, jamming snow into the crack while someone presses turf behind it. Another person leans their shoulder into a beam to hold it upright. No one is talking anymore, just breathing hard and working with urgency born of memory, because everyone here knows someone who didn't make it through a storm. And here comes the open scholarly debate. Did Viking homes collapse often? Some say no, that the architecture was sound, tested, refined over generations. Others point to collapsed sites, scattered bones under fallen beams, and written accounts that hint at families suffocating in their own homes, caught in the quiet disaster of a roof failure or wall blowout. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the middle. Most homes held, some didn't. And in winter, one failure was enough to doom everyone inside. You step back now, face raw from the cold air blowing in through the cracks you haven't sealed yet. You can't feel your fingertips. Your breath comes in shallow gusts, and your cloak smells like smoke and wet leather. But the wall is holding, for now. Back near the hearth, the children are quiet. Too quiet. They're watching the adults, absorbing every cue. One of them, probably no older than 6, is sharpening a stick with a little knife. Not out of threat, out of habit. You feel a strange pang. Not sadness, not pity, something else. Recognition. Because even the youngest here know what's expected of them. Everyone has a job. No one gets to opt out. Eventually the wind slows, not because it's finished, but because it's resting. You sit on the bench, body trembling from exertion, and listen to the house settling again. A creak here, a dripping sound from the eaves. The fire burns low, casting orange shadows that feel almost like the sun you haven't seen in weeks. Someone starts humming, an old tune, wordless and circular, like a lullaby passed down from 1,000 winters ago. No one died. The wall held, the roof didn't collapse, but you feel it in your bones. You were close. And this is what no saga really tells you, that sometimes surviving the storm doesn't feel like victory. It feels like having been spared. Like you rolled the dice and the house decided to let you live another day. You look around the room now, everyone's awake, no one's speaking, just sharing the silence. And in that silence, something unspoken connects you all. This is your world. Not swords and raids and glory, but this. Reinforcing a failing wall with frozen dirt and hope. Holding a beam with your back while the wind tries to knock the whole thing down. Watching the people you love sleep near a fire that could go out any minute. Knowing you'll do it all again tomorrow if you have to. And you will. Because this isn't just winter. This is the season that asked the question. And tonight your answer was yes. By the time the storm finally breaks, it's as if the world has exhaled. The wind gives one last long moan and then falls silent, leaving behind a stillness so complete it almost makes your ears ring. You step outside into a world remade, everything blanketed in white, smooth and perfect, like it was poured from the sky by some obsessive, detail-obsessed god. The air is sharp and clean, and for a moment the silence is so intense you almost feel like an intruder just by breathing. And yet, beneath that silence, everything is alive. The longhouse creaks gently as it adjusts to the cold. The animals shift in their pens, and somewhere off in the trees a raven calls once, like it's checking to make sure you all made it through. You did. Barely. But survival isn't scored by style points. It's pass/fail, and you passed. The worst of the winter is behind you now, or so they say. This is what's known in Norse regions as the late frost, the liminal space between deep winter and whatever spring thinks it's doing when it still snows half the week. The sun's coming back, slowly, testing its strength. The days are stretching, just a little, and with that stretch comes a new urgency. Now comes the part where you stop holding your breath and start rebuilding what the dark months took from you. You join the others in walking the perimeter, checking damage. The wall you patched with snow and desperation, still holding. The roof? No new leaks, though the turf near the back will need reinforcement. Someone marks it with charcoal so it'll be addressed before the next storm. The animal stalls need mucking out, and there's a broken gate where one of the goats, clearly unbothered by the apocalypse, tried to break free. Life is clawing its way back toward normal. Inside, the energy has changed. There's less brooding by the hearth, more motion, repairing boots, sorting tools, organising supplies. The fire burns steadily, but no longer feels like your only lifeline. You're not surviving by the hearth anymore, you're surviving around it. A subtle but powerful shift. Someone unearths a barrel of fermented fish that was buried outside under snow and straw. The The smell hits you like a spiritual crisis, but others treat it like a feast. You chew through a piece that tastes like regret and vinegar, and no one lets you spit it out. This is part of the deal. You live, you eat the weird fish. And here's a historical truth that never quite fits into the saga mould. The end of winter didn't bring immediate celebration. It brought work. Because everything that didn't collapse still needed checking. Everything that broke needed fixing. And everything you used up, food, rope, firewood, patience, had to be replaced before next season. The Vikings didn't view spring as a gift. They saw it as a warning. You head with a group down to the wood line, trudging through knee-deep snow that's starting to crust over from the sun. The trees are stiff with frost, but already you can hear water dripping. Somewhere under all this snow, the earth is stirring. You help chop branches for kindling, gather deadfall, and begin scouting new paths through the woods. Travel will start soon. Trade, messages, maybe even guests. One of the older women carries with her a small bundle of runes. She tosses them into the snow before you leave the tree line. Just a quick reading. She looks at them, frowns slightly, and mutters something about a late cold snap. Everyone nods, files that information away. You don't laugh at superstition when you've seen walls crack and roofs groan. If the runes say keep the firewood high and your boots dry, you listen. Here's your final fringe fact. Some Viking communities mark the seasonal shift with what we'd now call a house blessing. A ritual sweep of the longhouse, the symbolic closing of winter's chapter. They'd clear out ash, relight the hearth, and sometimes burn dried herbs to purify the space. Not dramatic, just ceremonial enough to remind you that you made it. You help with that now. The floor is swept with care. The hearth is cleared, its coals carefully rearranged and stoked like it's being reborn. A fresh bundle of juniper is tossed into the flames, and the scent fills the room with something clean and sharp and ancient. One by one, people move through the space in silence, laying hands on the beams, tapping the doorframe, murmuring whatever words they've carried through the long dark. Thanks. Please. Promises. No one tells you what to say. You place your hand on the post by the entrance, feel the grain beneath your fingers, warm, solid, real. And you think of all the nights you lay awake, listening to the wind, wondering if the walls would hold. You think of the goat, of the stew, of the crack that split the turf, of the spear, of the ship half buried in snow, of the fire that never went out. And you whisper, next time, let me be this strong again. Because that's the thing the sagas miss. Survival doesn't crown you a hero, it just asks you to do it again. Next winter, next storm, next wall that threatens to give way. There's no final battle, just seasons, cycles, snow, fire, shelter, and in the middle of all of that, you, not unbreakable, just not broken yet. The fire glows brighter now, catching in the cleaned hearthstone, its light bouncing off the tools laid neatly on the bench. Outside, the sky's cloudless for the first time in weeks. The sun is low and pale, but it's there, and inside the longhouse breathes again. You breathe with it, and just like that, the snow that once threatened to collapse the roof now slides quietly off the edges, melting by day and freezing by night in thin, glassy sheets. The sun still isn't warm, not really, but it hangs a little longer each afternoon, as if it's finally remembering its responsibilities. The days of crisis have eased, but you still move cautiously, like someone recovering from a fever. The longhouse is quieter now, not out of fear, but in that peaceful, exhausted way of people who've done something hard and survived it. You sit by the hearth, same spot, same cloak, same boots now crusted with salt and smoke, watching the embers fade into a gentle orange glow. The fire doesn't need to rage anymore, it just needs to be there, steady and warm and familiar, a heartbeat. The others drift in and out of the room. One is mending a ripped tunic. Another is restringing a bow with fingers that move slower than they did in the fall. A child is sweeping, badly, but no one stops her. She's doing it with a kind of joy that only comes from knowing the worst is behind you, and you're just watching it all. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because you can. You made it. The house held. You held. Looking back, it wasn't one thing that saved you. It wasn't just the turf walls or the roof beams or the seal fat lamps or the clever use of goats as bed warmers. It was everything. Every little decision, every old tradition, every whispered charm and midnight patch job, every shared bowl of stew and silent truce between grumpy cousins, it all mattered. The Vikings didn't survive their winters because they were braver or stronger than anyone else. They survived because they prepared, because they believed in layers of clothing, of shelter, of meaning, because they built with purpose, repaired with urgency, and lived with the constant awareness that survival is never guaranteed. You can't conquer winter, you can only outlast it. And now you've done that. You stand up slowly and walk to the door. It's lighter than it felt last month, maybe because you're stronger now, or maybe because you know it swings open to something other than threat. You step outside and feel it, the world shifting. There's still snow on the ground, yes, but there's also birdsong, just one, thin and wobbly from somewhere in the pines, but it's there. You smile. The wind catches your cloak, and for once it doesn't steal your breath. It just moves past you, like winter saying goodbye. And you know, deep down, that it'll be back. But next time, so will you.